There are places where the ground remembers things it should not know, where wind sweeps across bare ridges, where sheep drift through scrub, where the earth keeps secrets older than the cities, older than the farms, older than the very idea that humans might stay in one place and call it home. In the limestone highlands of southeastern Turkey, between the dark wall of the Taurus Mountains and the pale sprawl of the Harran Plain, such a place waits. Its name is unremarkable, Göbekli Tepe, the Potbelly Hill. For millennia it rose gently above the surrounding land, a soft swell of earth and stone that shepherds used as a vantage point, that farmers quarried for building rubble, that no one thought to question. Yet beneath that ordinary surface, beneath the thorn bushes and the scattered fragments of carved limestone, lay something that would shatter every certainty archaeology had built about the dawn of civilization. A structure so vast, so deliberate, so impossibly ancient that its discovery would force an entire discipline to rewrite the story of who we were and what we were capable of becoming. Stay with us as we step into the longest journey we will take together, adrift through the limestone highlands of pre-pottery Neolithic Anatolia, through the ruins of sanctuaries raised by hands that should not have been able to raise them, through a world where the temple came before the city, where art preceded agriculture, where the sacred was carved into stone thousands of years before humanity learned to plant a seed and wait. On a warm afternoon in the autumn of 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt stood on the crown of a low ridge overlooking the Harran Plain and felt the ground beneath him shift in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. The ridge was unremarkable, chalky, strewn with flint, dotted with the same scrub that clothed 1,000 other hills in this corner of Anatolia. Locals had long known it as a source of convenient stone. Farmers hauled away blocks to build walls and pens, and the surface was littered with broken slabs, some carved, most not, all of them half buried and anonymous under the weight of centuries. Schmidt had come here almost by accident, following a lead from the local museum in Şanlıurfa, guided by two brothers, Mahmut and Ibrahim Yildiz, who farmed the land and had reported finds of worked stone. The site had been documented once before, in 1963, during a joint survey conducted by the universities of Istanbul and Chicago. That earlier team had noted the presence of stone slabs protruding from the soil, had logged the site, and had moved on, concluding with quiet confidence that the visible fragments were the remains of a medieval or Byzantine cemetery. Nothing to excavate, nothing to pursue. The survey report was filed, the site was forgotten, and for 3 decades Göbekli Tepe remained a low hill where sheep grazed and wind moved through thorn and stone. But Klaus Schmidt had recently returned from another site, a place called Nevalachori, some 50 kilometers to the northeast, where he had worked under the direction of his mentor Harold Hauptmann, excavating a settlement that would soon be lost forever. Nevalachori had been drowning slowly as the waters of the Ataturk Dam reservoir crept higher each season, and the excavation had been a race against time, a salvage operation conducted in the shadow of an unstoppable flood. What they had uncovered there, between 1983 and 1991, had been unlike anything expected from a site of its age. Monumental T-shaped limestone pillars standing in a small rectangular cult building, carved reliefs of animals and abstract symbols, and most hauntingly, a cache of human skulls deliberately placed in niches, their empty sockets staring out from the walls. The architecture was strange, deliberate, laden with a vocabulary no one had seen before in the pre-pottery Neolithic. And then, in 1992, the reservoir swallowed it. The water rose over the trenches, over the pillars, over the House of Skulls, and Nevalachori became a submerged memory, its stones resting in the cold dark beneath the surface of the lake. Standing now on Göbekli Tepe, Schmidt recognized something in the fragments scattered across the ridge. The stone slabs were not grave markers. They were not random. They were the tops of pillars, T-shaped, monolithic, unmistakable. The same architectural form he had documented at Nevalachori. The same broad, flat heads tapering to narrower shafts. The same limestone, pale and coarse-grained, quarried from the bedrock of the ridge itself. He walked the site slowly, mapping the visible stones in his mind, noting their orientation, their spacing, the way they formed rough arcs and alignments that suggested something circular, something intentional, something buried. Broken fragments of animal carvings lay among the rubble, an eye here, the curve of a haunch there, a beak, a claw. The ground was littered with flint tools, tens of thousands of them, blades and scrapers worn smooth by use and time. And everywhere, beneath the surface clutter, Schmidt could sense the outline of something larger, something that had been deliberately covered and left to sleep. He knew in that moment, standing on the ridge with the plain stretching away to the south and the mountains dark against the northern sky, that he was looking at the exposed edge of a structure far older and far grander than Nevelachori. He knew that if he walked away, the site would remain a quarry, its stones hauled off piece by piece until nothing remained but a flattened hill and a few lines in an old survey report. And he knew, with the peculiar clarity that comes only once or twice in a career, that this place would consume the rest of his life. The following year, in 1995, formal excavations began. Schmidt returned with a team from the German Archaeological Institute, with shovels and brushes, with surveying equipment and cameras, with the quiet determination of someone who understands that what lies beneath his feet will not be easily explained. The ridge rose 15 metres above the surrounding plain, a man-made tell built up over millennia of human activity, covering an area of roughly 8 hectares, a footprint larger than 10 soccer fields. Geophysical surveys conducted in those early seasons with ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry revealed at least 20 circular structures buried beneath the soil, arranged across the ridge in clusters, overlapping and intersecting in ways that suggested centuries of construction, abandonment, and renewal. And yet, as the first trenches were opened and the soil was carefully removed layer by layer, it became clear that less than 5% of the site had been disturbed by modern activity. The rest waited, sealed beneath tons of earth and stone, as it had waited for more than 11,000 years. The earliest pillars to emerge from the ground were staggering in both scale and craft. The largest central pair stood more than 5.5 metres tall, 18 feet of limestone carved from a single block, their surfaces smoothed and shaped, with a precision that seemed impossible for the age in which they were made. Each pillar weighed between 7 and 10 tons, though some estimates, based on the dimensions of unfinished examples still resting in the quarries nearby, suggested weights reaching 16 tons or more. They were not simple standing stones. They were sculpted, anthropomorphic, their flat tops suggesting heads, their bodies tapering down to narrower bases that had been set deep into the bedrock. On many pillars, carved in low relief, were arms bent at the elbows, hands clasped across the front, fingers delicately rendered. Belts circled their midsections, and what appeared to be loincloths hung below, the folds of fabric suggested by careful tooling of the stone. These were not representations of humans. They were something else, beings with human attributes, presences given form in limestone, standing in silent circles as if in perpetual assembly. And around them, carved into the outer ring of smaller pillars and onto the walls of the enclosures themselves, was a menagerie. Foxes prowled across the stone, their bushy tails curled, their eyes alert. Lions crouched, muscles tensed beneath their hides, their manes rendered in radiating lines. Scorpions curved their segmented bodies, stingers raised. Vultures spread their wings, their beaks open, their talons gripping unseen prey. Snakes coiled and stretched, their scales suggested by careful rows of incised lines. Spiders dangled on invisible threads. Boars charged, their tusks jutting forward. The images were not decorative. They were not random. They were deliberate, specific, layered with an intentionality that suggested meaning, symbolic, cosmological, sacred. Standing in the excavated enclosures surrounded by stone beings and stone animals, one could not help but feel that this was a place where the boundary between the material and the immaterial had been deliberately thinned, where the carved figures were not mere art but participants in something older and stranger than architecture alone could contain. For decades, Western archaeology had operated on a narrative so confident, so thoroughly embedded in the discipline's foundational texts, that it had achieved the status of fact. The story went like this. For nearly 200,000 years, anatomically modern humans lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers, moving with the seasons, following game, gathering wild plants, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their passage, stone tools, fire pits, the occasional burial. Then, around 10,000 years before the present, something shifted. In the fertile river valleys of the Near East, in the crescent of land stretching from the Persian Gulf to the eastern Mediterranean, humans began to domesticate plants and animals. Wheat and barley were cultivated, sheep and goats were penned. Villages appeared, clusters of mud brick houses arranged around shared spaces, their inhabitants no longer wandering but staying season after season, tending fields and herds. With agriculture came surplus, and with surplus came specialization: potters, weavers, toolmakers, priests. Social hierarchies emerged, leadership became formalized, and only then, as the culmination of this long, slow process, did humans begin to build monuments. Temples were raised to honor the gods who blessed the harvest. Tombs were constructed for rulers who commanded the labor of thousands. Stone circles marked the passage of the sun and the turning of the year. This was the Neolithic Revolution, a term coined by the Australian-born British archaeologist V. Gordon Childe in his seminal works of the 1930s and 1940s, Man Makes Himself. In 1936, What Happened in History in 1942, Childe's model was elegant, linear, and profoundly influential. He argued that the domestication of plants and animals was the single most important transformation in human history, the hinge upon which all subsequent development turned. The Neolithic package, as it came to be known, was a bundled set of innovations: plant cultivation, animal husbandry, permanent settlement, pottery, and eventually monumental architecture. Each element depended on the one before it. You could not have temples without priests, and you could not have priests without surplus food, and you could not have surplus food without farming. The sequence was fixed. The timeline was clear. Hunter-gatherers were mobile, egalitarian, living hand-to-mouth existences that left no room for the sustained, large-scale cooperation required to quarry limestone, carve pillars, and assemble them into circles. Monuments were the province of settled agriculturalists, the late flowering of civilizations that had already mastered the basics of survival and turned their attention to the transcendent. The evidence seemed to support this. Stonehenge, the great megalithic monument on the Salisbury Plain in southern England, was dated to the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, its construction beginning around 3000 BCE and continuing in phases for another 500 years. The sarsen stones, some weighing 35 tons, had been dragged from quarries 25 kilometres away, shaped with stone mauls, and erected in a configuration that suggested both ritual significance and astronomical knowledge. Yet Stonehenge was built by a society that already possessed agriculture, pottery, and complex trade networks. The Great Pyramid of Giza, constructed around 2500 BCE, stood as the pinnacle of state-level organisation, a monument to the pharaoh Khufu that required the labour of tens of thousands of workers, fed and housed by a bureaucracy capable of mobilising resources across an entire kingdom. The pyramid rose nearly 150 metres into the Egyptian sky, its limestone casing blocks fitted with such precision that a blade could not slip between them. But the pyramid, too, was the product of a long-established agricultural civilization, one that had been farming the Nile floodplain for millennia. The Sumerian cities of southern Mesopotamia, Uruk-Eridu, rose around 3500 BCE, their ziggurats towering over the plains, their temple complexes administering vast estates, their scribes recording transactions in the world's first writing. But the cities, like the pyramids, like Stonehenge, were built by people who had long since abandoned the nomadic life. This was the wall that stood between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic, between the wandering and the settled, between the simple and the complex. Hunter-gatherers, the paradigm insisted, were incapable of monumental construction. They lacked the surplus, the organisation, the motivation. Their lives were consumed by the search for food, by the daily struggle to survive. Art for them was portable: beads, carvings, painted tools. Architecture was temporary: hide tents, brush shelters, caves when they could be found. The great monuments of prehistory belonged to a later chapter, a stage humanity reached only after agriculture had unlocked the resources and the social structures necessary to dream in stone. The sequence was fixed, the timeline was certain, and for most of the 20th century no one had reason to doubt it. Klaus Schmidt, standing in the freshly opened trenches of Göbekli Tepe in the summer of 1996, was looking at something that should not exist. The pillars rising from the bedrock, the carved animals, the circular enclosures, none of it fit the timeline. Radiocarbon dates taken from charcoal fragments embedded in the mortar between stones returned results that seemed, at first, impossible. 9600 BCE, give or take a century. The pre-pottery Neolithic A, a period so early that pottery had not yet been invented, that agriculture was still 1,000 years in the future, that the entire region was populated by mobile foragers living in small, loosely organised bands. And yet here, carved into the ridge, were structures that rivaled anything built in the Bronze Age, pillars that dwarfed the standing stones of Stonehenge, iconography as complex as anything found in the temple complexes of Sumer. The site was not a village. There were no houses, no hearths, no storage bins, no middens filled with the refuse of daily life. It was something else, a place people came to, laboured at and left. A sanctuary, a temple, a centre of ritual and gathering that predated by thousands of years the supposed prerequisites for such a place to exist. Schmidt understood immediately that he was not simply excavating a site, he was dismantling a paradigm. The wall of prehistory, so carefully constructed by Childe and his successors, was cracking. If Göbekli Tepe was what it appeared to be, a monumental ritual centre built by hunter-gatherers, then the sequence was wrong. The timeline was wrong. The entire model of how civilization emerged was wrong. Agriculture did not come first. Sedentism did not come first. The surplus did not come first. First came the temple. First came the gathering. First came the need, or the desire, to create a place where the sacred could be anchored in stone, where the community could assemble, where the boundary between the human and the more than human could be marked and honoured. And only then, perhaps as a consequence of that gathering, as people returned year after year to the same ridge, to the same circles of stone, did the idea of staying take root. Did the wild grasses growing on the plain begin to be tended, their seeds selected, their harvest managed? Did the herds of gazelle and aurochs begin to be controlled, their movements anticipated, their young protected? Agriculture, Schmidt began to argue, was not the cause of civilization. It was the result. It was what happened when people who had already learned to cooperate, to organize, to build, needed a way to feed the gatherings they had created. Schmidt's commitment to Göbekli Tepe was absolute. He established a base of operations in the city of Şanlıurfa, 15 kilometers to the northeast, purchasing a house where he could store equipment, plan each season's work, and return to rest between the long days on the ridge. He conducted fieldwork in 2-month blocks, typically in the spring and again in the fall, when the heat of the Anatolian summer had passed and the winter rains had not yet begun. He hired local workers, many of them descendants of the shepherds and farmers who had known the ridge for generations, and trained them in the meticulous, patient work of archaeological excavation, scraping soil with trowels, brushing dust from carved surfaces, mapping each stone, each fragment, each layer of earth. He brought in specialists, osteologists to study the animal bones, lithic analysts to examine the flint tools, geophysicists to map the unexcavated portions of the site, radiocarbon laboratories to date the charcoal and bone. He published preliminary reports, gave lectures, wrote articles for both academic journals and popular audiences, and gradually, season by season, the outline of Göbekli Tepe began to emerge from the soil and from the fog of incomprehension that had surrounded it. The site was not alone. Schmidt knew this from the beginning. His work at Nevaluchori had already revealed that the T-shaped pillars, the monumental cult buildings, the carved reliefs of animals and abstract symbols were part of a broader architectural tradition, a style or a symbolic language shared across the region. And as excavations continued at Göbekli Tepe, reports began to come in from other sites scattered across the limestone highlands of southeastern Turkey and northern Syria. Karahan Tepe, a low mound 35 kilometers to the east, revealed stone pillars set into bedrock chambers, their surfaces carved with human faces and predatory animals. Sayburç, another site in the same region, yielded a stone panel depicting human figures, animals, and what appeared to be a narrative scene, one of the oldest examples of figurative art in Anatolia. Boncuklu Tarla, a small tell near the modern town of Dargasit, produced evidence of ritual feasting on a scale that suggested gatherings of hundreds, perhaps thousands of people. Çayönü, further north in the foothills of the Taurus, had been excavated since the 1960s and was known for its peculiar House of Skulls, a building where the remains of more than 400 individuals had been deposited, their bones mingled, their skulls arranged in rows. Each site was distinct, yet each shared elements of the same symbolic vocabulary: T-shaped pillars, animal iconography, deliberate burials, feasting, ritual. Göbekli Tepe was not an anomaly. It was the largest, the most elaborate, the most thoroughly excavated example of a phenomenon that stretched across the entire pre-pottery Neolithic world of Upper Mesopotamia. A sacred landscape, a network of sanctuaries, raised by people who were supposed to be incapable of such things. Schmidt's work at Nevalachori had given him the vocabulary to read Göbekli Tepe. That earlier site, excavated between 1983 and 1991 as the waters of the Ataturk Dam crept closer, had been smaller, more compact, but no less extraordinary. The cult building there had been rectangular rather than circular, its walls lined with stone benches, its floor paved with terrazzo, a smooth surface made of crushed limestone mixed with lime plaster, polished to a soft sheen. At the centre of the room stood two T-shaped pillars, smaller than those at Göbekli Tepe, but carved with the same care, their surfaces decorated with relief carvings of abstract symbols, H-shapes, nested crescents, zigzag lines. Along the walls, set into niches, were human skulls, their faces reconstructed with plaster, their eyes inlaid with shells, their features eerily lifelike. The building was not a house, it was not a workshop, it was a space dedicated to ritual, to the dead, to something sacred and deliberate that had left no written record, and could only be guessed at through the objects and the architecture it left behind. When Schmidt first saw the exposed stones at Göbekli Tepe in 1994, he recognised the same architectural grammar he had learned at Nevalachori. The T-shaped pillars were the same. The arrangement of stones in circular or near-circular enclosures was different but related. The animal iconography, the emphasis on predators and scavengers, foxes, lions, vultures, scorpions, echoed the symbolic language of the earlier site. And the absence of domestic structures, the lack of evidence for permanent habitation, suggested the same purpose. This was a place people came to, not a place they lived. A sanctuary, a temple, a centre of gathering for communities scattered across the highlands, drawing them together at certain times of the year, perhaps at the harvest of wild grains, perhaps at the migration of game, perhaps at moments dictated by the calendar, the stars, the cycles of the moon. Schmidt began to speak of Göbekli Tepe as the world's first temple, a phrase that would follow him through the rest of his career, sometimes celebrated, sometimes criticised, but always impossible to ignore. The ridge itself was a deliberate choice. Göbekli Tepe was not hidden. It was not tucked into a valley or sheltered by cliffs. It rose above the Harran Plain, visible for kilometres in every direction, a landmark that would have been known to every band, every family, every individual moving through the region. From its summit on a clear day, one could see the dark line of the Taurus Mountains to the north, the pale shimmer of the plain to the south, the distant thread of the Euphrates glinting in the sun. The ridge was a threshold, a place between the mountains and the plains, between the wild highlands and the open steppe, between the known and the unknown. And it was a place of stone. The limestone bedrock of the ridge provided the raw material for the pillars, and the quarries where they were carved lay just a few 100 metres away, open scars in the rock where unfinished pillars still lay, half freed from the stone, their surfaces roughed out but not yet smoothed, their final destinations never reached. The builders of Göbekli Tepe did not import their stone. They carved it from the ground beneath their feet, shaping the ridge itself into a monument, transforming the raw material of the earth into a vessel for the sacred. Schmidt's gamble was not simply professional, it was personal. He had seen Nevalachori disappear beneath the waters of the Ataturk Dam, had watched as the reservoir rose and the site was lost, its stones submerged, its mysteries sealed beneath the cold weight of the lake. He had felt the frustration of salvage archaeology, the race against time, the knowledge that no matter how quickly they worked, no matter how much they uncovered, the end was already decided. Göbekli Tepe offered something different. It was not threatened by a dam, not in immediate danger of destruction. It was simply there, waiting, patient, as it had waited for millennia. And Schmidt understood that if he committed to the site, if he made it the centre of his career, he might have the time to excavate it properly, to document it fully, to understand it not as a collection of isolated trenches but as a coherent whole. He might have the time to answer the questions that Nevalachori had left open. Who built these places? How were they organised? What did the symbols mean? What role did ritual play in the transition from foraging to farming? What did it mean that the temple came before the city? The site consumed him. For nearly 2 decades, from 1995 until his death in 2014, Schmidt returned to Göbekli Tepe season after season, opening new trenches, exposing new enclosures, uncovering new pillars. He became the site's most passionate advocate, its most articulate interpreter, and eventually its most famous champion. He wrote prolifically, published widely, and gave interviews to journalists, filmmakers, and documentary crews who descended on the ridge, drawn by the promise of a story that seemed almost too extraordinary to be true. And through it all, the site continued to reveal itself, layer by layer, stone by stone, as if it had been waiting all along for someone who would listen, who would look, who would understand that the ground remembers things it should not know, and that sometimes, if we are patient enough, if we are careful enough, it will tell us. Through the late 1990s and into the opening years of the new century, Schmidt's team moved methodically across the ridge, peeling back millennia of sediment with trowels and brushes, photographing every layer, mapping every stone. What emerged from the earth was an architectural vocabulary unlike anything else in the archaeological record of the period, a language written in limestone, expressed through pillars that rose from the bedrock like sentinels, their surfaces carved with images that seemed to ripple in the slanting light of dawn and dusk. The team designated the major structures by letter as they were uncovered: Enclosure A, Enclosure B, Enclosure C, Enclosure D. Each was roughly circular or oval in plan, scooped into the limestone plateau, their walls built from dry stone masonry that followed the natural contours of the excavated pit. And at the centre of each enclosure stood a pair of monoliths, taller and heavier than the rest, positioned facing one another across the open floor like silent guardians of a space whose function remained elusive. The pillars themselves were T-shaped, their forms simple yet deliberate, a vertical shaft rising from a base still anchored in the bedrock or set into shallow sockets, topped by a horizontal crosspiece that gave the stone an unmistakable anthropomorphic silhouette. Standing before one of these central pillars, one could not help but sense the presence of something, someone, embodied in the stone. The T-shape suggested shoulders and a head, though the head was left blank, devoid of eyes or mouth or any identifying feature. Lower on the shaft, carved in shallow relief, were belts, loincloths, arms bent at the elbows, hands clasped across an absent belly. The pillars were not abstract markers. They were beings, stylized and silent, their identities subsumed into the stone itself. Enclosure D, the largest and most extensively excavated, contained central pillars that reached heights of 5.5 meters, roughly the height of a modern 2-story building, and weighed between 10 and 16 metric tons. Surrounding this central pair was a ring of smaller pillars, each standing approximately 4 meters tall, set into the perimeter wall at regular intervals and connected by low stone benches that ran along the interior curve of the enclosure. The floor between the pillars was paved with terrazzo, a lime-based plaster polished to a smooth, reflective surface that would have caught the light of torches or the moon, transforming the enclosure into a chamber of shifting shadows and gleaming stone. The effect, even in the harsh light of midday excavation, was one of enclosure and intimacy, a space designed not for the open sky but for gathering, for focus, for something that required witnesses arranged in a circle, their attention drawn inward toward the centre where the 2 great pillars stood. The scale of the construction defied easy explanation. Each pillar had been quarried from the limestone plateau that surrounded the site, carved free from the bedrock using tools of flint and stone, shaped and smoothed and transported across distances ranging from 100 to several hundred meters. The absence of metal tools, wheeled vehicles or draft animals rendered the logistics staggering. To move a 10-ton block of limestone across uneven ground without rollers or sledges, without oxen or horses, required dozens of people working in concert, hauling, levering, bracing, inching the stone forward meter by meter, risking injury or death if the block shifted, if the rope snapped, if the coordination failed. And once the pillar arrived at the site, it had to be raised, tilted upright into a prepared socket or braced with packing stones, held steady as the earth was packed around its base, as the weight settled, as the stone became fixed in place. The labour was immense, the margin for error narrow, the commitment absolute. And then there was the quarry. Just a few hundred meters southwest of the main mound, the team found it, a broad expanse of exposed bedrock scored with channels and grooves, the scars of extraction etched into the stone like a map of ambition and effort. Here, the limestone had been cut away in rectangular trenches, narrow channels carved around the perimeter of each intended pillar to isolate the block from the surrounding rock. Wooden wedges would have been driven into the channels, soaked with water to swell and crack the stone, levering the block free inch by inch until it could be pried loose and hauled away. The process was slow, meticulous, vulnerable to the hidden flaws in the stone, a vein of softer material, a hairline fracture invisible from the surface, a sudden crack that rendered months of labour useless. In the quarry, one such failure lay exposed, a massive T-shaped pillar, still attached to the bedrock, its surface roughed out but not yet finished, stretched over 7 meters in length and 1.5 meters in thickness. Had it been completed, had it been freed and transported and raised, it would have weighed approximately 50 metric tons, more than 3 times the mass of the largest pillars already standing in the enclosures. The stone remained there, abandoned mid-carving, its intended destination unknown, its failure permanent. Whether the builders discovered a flaw in the limestone, whether the stone cracked during extraction, whether the project was simply too ambitious and was abandoned in favour of more manageable blocks, no record survives. Only the pillar itself endures, a monument to an attempt that exceeded capacity, a threshold crossed and found impassable. Standing in the quarry, one could trace the entire process. The initial survey of the rock, the marking of the perimeter, the slow carving of the channels, the insertion of wedges, the weighting, the levering, the moment when the stone either came free or shattered, when the labour bore fruit or dissolved into ruin. And behind every finished pillar, behind every enclosure, behind every carved relief and polished floor, lay the unspoken reality of the work. The bruised hands, the broken tools, the stones that cracked, the pillars that never rose, the attempts that failed and were covered over, forgotten, erased from the final record so that only the successes remained visible. Göbekli Tepe was not simply built. It was fought for, stone by stone, trench by trench, over generations that left no names, no kings, no inscriptions to mark their passing. The impossibility of the construction was not rhetorical, it was visceral, immediate, a problem that announced itself the moment one stood beside a central pillar and looked up at the blank face of the stone, imagining the weight, imagining the labour, imagining the coordination required to move such mass across such distance with such tools. How were the blocks transported? Were they dragged on sledges, hauled by ropes slung beneath the stone, braced by wooden levers? Were earthen ramps constructed, inclines built and dismantled as the pillar advanced? Were teams of labourers rotated in shifts, replacements brought in as exhaustion set in, the work continuing day and night until the stone reached its destination? The site offered no clear answers, only the finished result. Pillars standing upright, aligned, stable, their bases packed with stone and earth, their surfaces carved with images that required not only strength but precision, not only muscle but artistry. Schmidt estimated that the construction of a single enclosure, quarrying the stone, transporting the pillars, erecting them, building the perimeter walls, carving the reliefs, finishing the floor, would have required the coordinated labour of hundreds of individuals sustained over months or even years. The work was not within the capability of a few families, a single band, a handful of specialists. It required organisation, planning, hierarchy, roles assigned and responsibilities distributed. It required someone to oversee the quarrying, someone to manage the transport, someone to direct the raising of the pillars, someone to ensure that the work proceeded according to a design that existed not on paper. There was no paper, no writing, no permanent record, but in memory, transmitted through speech and gesture and example, preserved across seasons and generations by people who understood that what they were building was not for themselves alone but for something larger, something that would outlast them, something that demanded completion even in the absence of coercion, even in the absence of kings or states or written law. And yet, for all the effort, for all the monumental ambition encoded in the stone, the site remained profoundly strange. The pillars were not columns supporting a roof, no evidence of roofing timbers, no post holes, no structural framework suggested that the enclosures had ever been covered. The pillars stood open to the sky, exposed to sun and rain and wind, their carved surfaces weathering over millennia until Schmidt's team uncovered them, and the images emerged again, faint but legible from beneath the sediment. The enclosures were not houses, not granaries, not defensive works. They were something else, spaces designed for gathering, for ritual, for acts whose nature remained opaque but whose importance was undeniable. The architecture itself insisted on significance. No society invests such labour, such coordination, such resources into the construction of a monument unless the monument matters, unless it serves a purpose central to the community's identity, its cohesion, its understanding of the world and its place within it. The question of purpose hung over the site like a shadow. What were the enclosures for? What happened within them? Who was permitted to enter and who was excluded? Were the central pillars representations of ancestors, deities, mythic beings, or something without a modern equivalent, a category of the sacred that had no clear analogue in later religious traditions? The blank faces of the pillars offered no answers. They stared outward, impassive, their hands folded across their bellies, their bodies hidden beneath belts and loincloths that suggested human form without committing to human identity. They were simultaneously familiar and alien, recognizable and strange, a paradox embodied in stone. And then came the dates. Organic material recovered from the fill layers of the enclosures, charcoal from ancient fires, bone fragments, humic acids preserved in the lime plaster, was subjected to radiocarbon analysis at laboratories in Germany and the United States. The results, when they returned, were unambiguous. The construction of Göbekli Tepe's monumental Layer 3 enclosures began around 9600 BCE, placing the site firmly in the pre-pottery Neolithic A period, a time when human societies across the Fertile Crescent were still organised as mobile or semi-mobile hunter-gatherers. The dates were checked, rechecked, cross-referenced with stratigraphic evidence and ceramic typology from later occupation layers. They held. Göbekli Tepe was not a Bronze Age temple, not an Iron Age sanctuary, not even an early Neolithic village shrine. It was older than all of them, older by millennia, 9,600 years before the Common Era. The number sat heavily in the mind, resistant to easy comprehension. It predated Stonehenge by roughly 7,000 years, predated the Great Pyramid of Giza by approximately 65 centuries. It predated the invention of pottery, the domestication of crops, the domestication of animals. It predated metallurgy, the wheel, writing, cities, states, empires. It belonged to a world that left almost no trace beyond stone tools and scattered bone, a world that existed at the boundary between the Pleistocene and the Holocene, when the glaciers were still retreating, when the climate was still stabilizing, when the megafauna, mammoths, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, were vanishing from the earth, and the landscape was opening into the grasslands and woodlands that would define the new age. The people who built Göbekli Tepe lived in a world unrecognizable to later civilizations. They had no bronze, no iron, no gold. They had no written records, no kings, no palaces. They had no temples in the sense that later cultures would understand the term, no priests in robes, no codified doctrine, no sacred texts. And yet they built something monumental, something that required foresight and planning and collective effort, on a scale previously attributed only to agricultural societies, only to civilizations with surplus food and centralized authority and the capacity to compel labor. The conventional timeline, foraging to farming to villages to cities to temples, was not merely revised by Göbekli Tepe, it was inverted. The temple came first, the rest followed. The implications were seismic. If Göbekli Tepe was indeed a ritual center constructed by hunter-gatherers, then the entire narrative of the Neolithic revolution required re-examination. Agriculture was not the engine that drove social complexity. It was not the prerequisite for monumental architecture, for organized labor, for the coordination of hundreds of people toward a common goal. Something else had come before, something that left almost no archaeological signature beyond the stones themselves. An idea, a belief, a shared vision powerful enough to mobilize communities that had no permanent settlements, no stored grain, no domesticated animals to sustain prolonged construction projects. The question shifted from how did they build it, to why did they build it? And behind that question lay another, deeper and more unsettling. Who were they? The people who carved the pillars and raised the enclosures left no houses at Göbekli Tepe, no middens thick with domestic refuse, no grain storage pits, no evidence of year-round habitation. The site was not a village. It was not a town. It was a place people came to, a destination, a locus of gathering that drew individuals and groups from across the surrounding landscape for reasons that remained, in the early years of excavation, tantalizingly unclear. Schmidt's team searched the immediate vicinity for signs of permanent settlement. Foundations, hearths, storage facilities, the detritus of daily life, and found almost nothing. Göbekli Tepe stood alone on its ridge, a monument without a city, a temple without a congregation housed nearby, an architectural enigma that seemed to defy every expectation of how early human societies were supposed to organize themselves. The subsistence evidence, when it emerged, deepened the paradox. Zooarchaeological analysis conducted by Joris Peters of the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich identified the faunal remains recovered from the site. Anatolian gazelle, aurochs, red deer, wild boar, large birds, foxes, all wild. No sheep, no goats, no cattle, no pigs, none of the domesticated animals that later Neolithic societies would depend upon. The people who built Göbekli Tepe hunted their food. They tracked game across the steppe and the highlands, brought down gazelle in coordinated drives, butchered aurochs in the field, carried the meat back to temporary camps where they feasted and shared and moved on. They were hunter-gatherers, mobile or semi-mobile, their lives structured around the rhythms of the wild herds and the seasonal abundance of plants, their technologies rooted in stone and bone and hide, their social organisation fluid and egalitarian in ways that left no clear material signature. And yet they built Göbekli Tepe. They quarried 10-ton blocks of limestone, transported them across rough terrain, raised them upright, carved them into stylized beings, surrounded them with rings of smaller pillars, paved the floors, carved the walls, returned season after season to add new enclosures, new pillars, new images. They organised the labour, fed the workers, sustained the project across decades or centuries, maintained the memory of the design and the purpose even as generations passed, and the original builders grew old and died, and were replaced by their children and their children's children. They did all of this without agriculture, without permanent settlements, without the surplus food that every textbook on the Neolithic revolution insisted was necessary for such undertakings. The workforce paradox was unavoidable. To build Göbekli Tepe required feeding hundreds of people, not for a single day or a single week, but for extended periods, weeks or months at a time, repeated over years. A hunting band of 20 or 30 individuals could not sustain such a project. The logistics collapsed under scrutiny. Feeding 200 people for even a single week required immense quantities of meat and plant food, resources that had to be hunted or gathered from the surrounding landscape and brought to the site. And while the upper Mesopotamian plateau was rich in game during the early Holocene, while gazelle migrated in vast herds and wild grains grew thick in the valleys, the act of concentrating so many people in one place for prolonged periods put enormous pressure on local resources. The land could not sustain permanent occupation by a population large enough to build monumental architecture, and yet the architecture existed. The only explanation that made sense was coordination across a broader landscape. Göbekli Tepe was not built by a single band or even a single tribe. It was built by a network of communities scattered across the region who converged on the ridge at specific times, perhaps seasonally, perhaps tied to celestial events, perhaps in response to social or ritual calendars that left no written record, to contribute labour, to participate in feasts, to witness ceremonies, to affirm bonds of kinship and alliance that extended beyond immediate family groups. The site was a gathering place, a pilgrimage centre, a node in a web of relationships that connected people across hundreds of square kilometres of steppe and highland and river valley. But if that was true, if Göbekli Tepe functioned as a regional ritual centre for dispersed hunter-gatherer bands, then the social complexity required to maintain it was extraordinary. The construction of each enclosure required not only labour but planning, leadership, decision-making structures capable of coordinating the efforts of individuals who did not live together year-round, who owed no permanent allegiance to a central authority, who could walk away at any moment and return to their own territories and their own lives. The pillars could not be raised by coercion. There were no kings, no standing armies, no police to enforce compliance. The work had to be voluntary, motivated by something other than fear or compulsion. by belief perhaps, by the promise of participation in something sacred, by the desire to honour ancestors or appease deities, or mark the boundaries of the world in stone. The ground beneath Göbekli Tepe was not silent. It was thick with questions, layered with paradoxes, heavy with the weight of a past that refused to conform to expectation. And as Schmidt's team continued to dig, as new enclosures emerged and new pillars were uncovered, and the full extent of the site began to reveal itself, the questions only multiplied, deepening and branching like roots pushing through limestone, searching for soil, searching for answers that the stone, for all its permanence, withheld. The stone remembers what was carved into it. At Göbekli Tepe, across the pillars of enclosures A through D, across dozens of surfaces smoothed and shaped by hands that held obsidian blades and flint chisels, a menagerie appears. Not in paintings, not in clay, but in bas relief, figures emerging from the limestone itself as if the stone had been peeled back to reveal forms waiting beneath. Foxes crouch low, ears flattened, eyes wide. Aurochs charge forward, shoulders massive, horns swept back in curves that span the width of a human torso. Wild boar bristle, tusks jutting, bodies tense with aggression. Cranes stretch their necks upward, beaks open, wings half spread. Ducks paddle in formation, their bodies rendered with careful attention to the slope of their backs and the angle of their heads. Gazelles leap, legs extended, caught mid-stride. Snakes coil and twist, their scales suggested by incised lines, their bodies wrapping around the edges of pillars or slithering across flat surfaces in sinuous paths. Scorpions raise their tails, pincers open, segmented bodies carved with precision. Spiders crouch, legs spread, abdomens round and heavy. Vultures perch, wings folded, watching. Lions, or wildcats, the distinction blurred by stylization, bare their teeth, claws extended, bodies coiled for the strike. Insects, their forms harder to identify, cluster near the bases of pillars or drift across the upper registers of the carvings, wings and legs rendered in miniature. The variety is staggering. The density is relentless. Some pillars carry a single creature, isolated and monumental, dominating the surface. Others are crowded, a riot of forms jostling for space, animals layered over one another, limbs overlapping, heads turned in different directions, the composition so dense it takes time to pass the individual figures from the whole. The skill is undeniable. These are not crude scratches, not rough outlines hastily incised by unskilled hands. The animals are anatomically plausible, their proportions correct or only slightly exaggerated for emphasis, their postures drawn from observation. Whoever carved them knew these creatures intimately, knew the way a fox held its tail, the way a boar lowered its head before charging, the way a crane's neck curved when it called. The carvings carry the weight of direct experience, of eyes that watched and hands that translated sight into stone. Klaus Schmidt and his colleague Oliver Dietrich, working through the published corpus of imagery across the excavated enclosures, began to notice patterns. Not uniformity, the carvings were too varied for that, but tendencies, clusters, concentrations. Certain animals appeared more frequently in certain enclosures. In Enclosure A, snakes dominated the iconography, their sinuous bodies winding across multiple pillars, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, their forms interwoven in ways that suggested intention, arrangement, narrative. In Enclosure B, foxes appeared again and again, crouching, prowling, their bodies low to the ground, their tails trailing behind them. In Enclosure C, wild boar took precedence, their massive shoulders and forward-thrusting heads repeated across the stone surfaces. In Enclosure D, the focus shifted. Birds became prominent, cranes and ducks and other avian forms, joined by insects, their delicate bodies carved with surprising care given their small size. The distribution was not random. Each enclosure seemed to carry its own symbolic vocabulary, its own set of creatures that recurred and reinforced one another, as if each space had been dedicated to a particular theme or aligned with a particular set of meanings. The cataloguing continued. By the time Dietrich and his team completed their survey, they had documented 149 sculptural elements across the site, 86 depicting animals, 38 depicting humans, 9 representing composites, beings that merged human and animal traits in ways that defied easy classification, 4 anthropomorphic masks, 3 Farley, and 9 forms too fragmentary or ambiguous to identify with confidence. The sheer scale of the menagerie was overwhelming. This was not decoration. This was not ornament added to architecture as an afterthought. The animals were central, integral, woven into the fabric of the site with the same care and attention that shaped the pillars themselves. The question was immediate and unavoidable. What did they mean? Were they totems, markers of clan identity, the emblems of social groups who gathered at Göbekli Tepe to affirm their alliances and distinguish themselves from one another? The enclosure-specific iconography suggested as much. If enclosure A belonged to the people of the snake and enclosure B to the people of the fox, then the architecture itself became a map of social relationships, a territory divided not by geography but by symbol, by the creatures each group claimed as their own. Were they spirit animals, guides, or companions for journeys into the otherworld, entities encountered in visions or dreams by shamans who moved between the human realm and the realm of the spirits? The aggressive postures, the predatory stances, the sense of watchfulness that permeated so many of the carvings, these could be read as images of power, of beings who possessed knowledge or abilities that humans did not, who mediated between worlds and carried messages back and forth across boundaries that ordinary people could not cross. Were they cosmological symbols, representations of forces or principles that governed the world, life and death, predator and prey, the cycles of the seasons, the movement of the stars? The scorpions and snakes, the vultures and lions, the careful attention to species that hunted and species that were hunted. All of it could be understood as a language, a system of meaning encoded in stone, intended to communicate truths about the structure of reality, the nature of existence, the relationships that bound human beings to the land and the sky, and the creatures with whom they shared the world. Or were they something else, entirely? Something that resisted the categories scholars brought to the site, something rooted in a worldview so different from modern assumptions that attempts to translate it into familiar terms inevitably distorted the original intention. The stone offered no answers. The animals stared back, silent, their eyes blank, their mouths open or closed, their bodies frozen in postures that suggested movement, intention, presence. But the meaning behind the presence remained out of reach, glimpsed but never grasped, sensed but never spoken. And then there were the hands. Carved along the sides of several pillars in low relief, barely raised above the surface of the stone, human arms appeared. Slender arms, elongated, running vertically down the length of the pillar shaft, fingers extended and meeting near the centre of the figure, resting just above or beside a carved belt or loincloth. The fingers were visible, individually rendered, not as abstract shapes but as recognisable human digits, slightly curved, positioned with care. On some pillars, a fox pelt hung below the waist, its tail trailing downward, the fur suggested by texture rather than detail. The belts were elaborate, sometimes circular buckles clearly defined, sometimes simpler bands of incised lines, but always present, always marking the boundary between the upper body and the lower, between the arms above and the garment below. The implications were immediate and unsettling. The T-shaped pillars were not merely decorated stones, they were representations. The horizontal capstone at the top was a head, stylized and reduced to pure geometry, devoid of features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, no hair, nothing that individualized or humanized, but a head nonetheless. The vertical shaft was a body, seen from the side, narrow and monumental, rising meters into the air, shoulders implied by the junction of the T, the arms carved along the flanks, the belt cinching the waist, the loincloth or pelt covering the lower body. The pillars were beings, anthropomorphic figures, giants standing upright, hands folded across their abdomens or resting at their sides, bodies adorned with the creatures carved into their surfaces, foxes climbing their legs, snakes coiling across their chests, vultures perching on their shoulders, scorpions crawling along their arms. They were not passive objects, they were presences, entities carved from limestone and erected in circles, standing in communities of their own kind, facing inward or outward depending on their placement, watching the space between them with eyeless heads, waiting. The two central pillars in each enclosure were always the tallest, the most massive, the most imposing. In enclosure D, pillars 18 and 31 stood 5.5 meters tall, their weight estimated at 10 tons each, their surfaces smooth and largely uncarved compared to the peripheral pillars that surrounded them. They presided. They anchored the space, defining its center, establishing a focal point toward which all other pillars oriented themselves. The smaller pillars around the perimeter, connected by low stone benches, faced inward. Their carved animals turned toward the central pair as if in attendance, as if gathered for an assembly or a ceremony, or a confrontation that played out in silence, in stillness, in the fixed geometry of stone. A visitor to Göbekli Tepe, a pilgrim, a participant, a hunter arriving from the surrounding steppe to join in the rituals that took place within the enclosures, did not enter a hall. They stepped into a congregation of giants, into a space inhabited by beings whose scale dwarfed human proportions, whose presence dominated the architecture, whose blank faces offered no reassurance, no recognition, no acknowledgement of kinship. The experience was not one of shelter or comfort. It was confrontation, immersion, the crossing of a threshold into a space where human beings were not the primary actors, where the pillars themselves were the audience or the witnesses or the participants in whatever took place on the polished lime plaster floors. The architecture was theology. The enclosures were not metaphors for the sacred. They were the sacred, materialized, made permanent, carved into the ridge and anchored in bedrock, a cosmology written in stone and inhabited by beings who wore belts and loincloths, and carried animals on their bodies like living tapestries, like maps of the world rendered in limestone and shadow. Standing among the pillars, one cannot help but feel the gaze that is not there. The facelessness is not an absence, it is a statement. The blank T-shaped heads refuse individuality, refuse personality, refuse the markers that distinguish one human being from another. They are anonymous and universal, archetypal rather than particular, entities who represent something broader than any single person or ancestor or deity. Yet the hands ground them, tether them to the human form, to the body's anatomy and proportions, to the simple physical fact of fingers and thumbs and palms. The tension between abstraction and specificity, between the geometric and the organic, between the blank and the detailed, runs through every carved surface, every incised line, every polished edge. The pillars are not quite human, not quite spirit, not quite God. They occupy a space between categories, a liminal zone where distinctions blur and meanings multiply, and the question of what these beings were, what they represented, what they embodied, what they demanded or promised or witnessed, remains suspended, unresolved, waiting for an answer that the stone will not provide. And yet one surface at Göbekli Tepe concentrates every unresolved question, every interpretive ambiguity, every layer of controversy that has accumulated around the site since Schmidt first recognized the ridge for what it was. Pillar 43, standing in enclosure D, is the most complex single carved surface discovered in the Neolithic world. The composition is dense, crowded, almost chaotic in its layering of forms. A large vulture dominates the upper portion of the pillar, one wing raised as if in mid-flight or mid-gesture, the feathers carved with careful attention to structure and overlap. Below the raised wing, a round disc or sphere hovers, its surface smooth, its meaning unclear. Is it an egg? A severed head? A sun or moon symbol? The object floats in the space defined by the vulture's body, connected to nothing, anchored by nothing, simply present. Below and to the side, a headless human figure appears, the body athyphalic, the posture suggesting either ritual display or violent death, the absence of the head unmistakable and deliberate. Scorpions crawl across the lower register, their tails raised, their pincers spread. Serpents twist and coil, their bodies threading through the gaps between other figures, their heads small and flattened, their scales incised in delicate lines. Other symbols crowd the surface, geometric shapes, abstract glyphs, forms that resist identification. And above, near the top of the pillar, a row of 3 arch-topped rectangular forms appears, each roughly the same size, each clearly defined, each separated from its neighbours by a small gap. Colloquially, they have been called handbags, a name born from their shape rather than from any functional interpretation. What they represent remains a matter of fierce debate. Klaus Schmidt called Pillar 43 possibly the world's oldest pictogram, a deliberate attempt to communicate meaning through imagery, to record a narrative or encode a message in stone, to create something that functioned not merely as art or decoration, but as a form of writing, a precursor to the scripts that would emerge millennia later in Sumer and Egypt and the Indus Valley. The suggestion was provocative. If Pillar 43 was a pictogram, then it implied intention on a different scale. Not the spontaneous carving of an individual artist, but the execution of a plan, a design, a composition that followed rules or conventions shared by a community, that carried meaning legible to those who knew how to read it. The pillar became a battleground. In 2017, Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis published a paper in Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry proposing an interpretation that sent shockwaves through the archaeological community and far beyond. They argued that Pillar 43 was not a mythological or ritual image but an astronomical record, a star map encoding the positions of constellations visible in the night sky approximately 10,900 BCE, and that the imagery, the vulture, the scorpion, the sphere, the headless figure, commemorated a catastrophic comet impact that triggered the Younger Dryas cooling period, a sudden climatic downturn that plunged the Northern Hemisphere back into near-glacial conditions for more than 1,000 years. The hypothesis was bold, specific, and deeply controversial. Sweatman and Tsikritsis mapped the animals on Pillar 43 onto constellations, arguing that the vulture corresponded to what would later be known as Lyra, the scorpion to Scorpius, the snake to Hydra, and that the sphere represented the sun or the comet itself. They claimed statistical significance for their mappings, suggesting that the probability of the correlations occurring by chance was vanishingly small, and they framed Göbekli Tepe not as a temple or a ritual centre, but as a memorial, a monument built by survivors of the impact to record the event, to warn future generations, to mark in stone the moment when the sky fell and the world changed. The response from the site's excavators was swift and unequivocal. Jens Nottroff and Oliver Dietrich, both members of the German Archaeological Institute team, publicly rejected the interpretation, calling it extremely far-fetched, unsupported by the archaeological context, and inconsistent with the broader iconographic patterns visible across the site. They argued that the animals on Pillar 43 were not constellation markers, but participants in a narrative rooted in Neolithic death cults, in beliefs about the soul's journey after death, in the role of vultures and other scavengers in excarnation practices, the exposure of corpses to the elements, and to carrion birds as a deliberate funerary rite. The sphere, they suggested, was more likely a severed head or a symbol of the soul than a celestial body, and the headless figure was not a victim of a comet impact but a representation of the deceased, the body rendered incomplete by the removal of the head, a practice attested in other pre-pottery Neolithic sites across the Levant and Anatolia. The debate escalated. Proponents of the comet hypothesis pointed to the statistical probabilities, to the alignment of the imagery with known celestial events, to the fact that the Younger Dryas impact theory, while still contested, had gained traction in some scientific circles based on geochemical and stratigraphic evidence from sites in North America and Europe. Critics countered that the significance levels were overstated, that the mappings relied on subjective rankings of how well each animal fit each constellation, that the method was self-scored and non-validated, and that the entire exercise imposed a modern astronomical framework onto imagery created by people whose understanding of the sky, while sophisticated, bore no resemblance to the constellations defined by Greek and later astronomers. The handbag glyphs became another focal point. Were they architectural symbols, stylized representations of the circular enclosures themselves, a kind of map or blueprint encoded into the pillar? Were they weights for beam balances, markers of measurement or trade, evidence of economic systems more complex than expected for mobile hunter-gatherers? Were they solstice and equinox markers, symbols tied to the solar calendar, to the movements of the sun across the horizon, to the cycles that governed planting and harvesting even in a world before domesticated crops? Or were they something else, something that fit none of these categories, something that required a leap of imagination historians and archaeologists were reluctant to make. Recent scholarship has only deepened the mystery. In 2026, Alexander Zavali proposed that the carvings at Göbekli Tepe and related sites might represent a structured sacred language, a symbolic system shared across vast distances, linking Anatolian Neolithic societies to contemporaneous cultures in southeastern Europe, specifically the Tripelia culture of modern-day Ukraine. The hypothesis suggested that the imagery was not site-specific, not locally generated, but part of a broader network of meaning that transcended geography, that connected dispersed communities through shared symbols, shared stories, shared cosmologies. If true, the implications were staggering. The pillars were not isolated creations but nodes in a web of communication, monuments that spoke to one another across hundreds or thousands of kilometers, that carried messages intended not only for the people who gathered at Göbekli Tepe, but for audiences far beyond the ridge, audiences who shared the language carved into the stone and understood the meanings encoded in vultures and scorpions and handbags and headless figures. But the hypothesis remained speculative, its evidence fragmentary, its mechanisms unclear. How did such a language develop? How was it transmitted? What social structures, what networks of exchange or pilgrimage or alliance sustained the continuity of meaning across such distances and such spans of time? The questions multiplied, branching and deepening, each answer generating new uncertainties, new avenues of inquiry, new reasons to return to the stone and study it again, searching for details missed, for patterns overlooked, for clues that might unlock the code inscribed on Pillar 43 and across the menagerie that surrounded it. Standing before Pillar 43, one feels the weight of all that remains unknown. The vulture's wing is raised, the sphere hovers, the headless figure stands or falls, the scorpions crawl, the handbags wait, their meaning suspended, their purpose withheld. The stone does not speak, not in words, not in the language of explanation or certainty. It offers only the image, the form, the arrangement of figures that once meant something specific to the people who carved them, who gathered in Enclosure D and stood among the pillars and looked at the vulture and the sphere and understood what they were seeing, what they were meant to remember, what they were being asked to believe or honour or fear. That understanding is gone now, eroded by time, buried with the generations who carried it, lost in the millennia that separate the Neolithic from the present. What remains is the carving, the limestone surface dense with imagery, the single most concentrated expression of symbolic intention ever created by hunter-gatherers, a surface that refuses simplicity, that resists reduction, that holds in tension every interpretive framework brought to bear on it, and collapses none of them, that remains open, contested, alive with possibility and frustration in equal measure. Pillar 43 is not a solution. It is the distillation of the mystery, the central enigma made visible, the question carved into stone and left standing in Enclosure D for anyone willing to look, to wonder, to admit that some things remain beyond reach, even when they are right in front of us, carved in detail, preserved for 10,000 years, waiting. The ridge was not silent. For thousands of years it roared. The backfill deposits at Göbekli Tepe tell a story the pillars cannot. Beneath the rubble and the worked flint packed into the layers of deliberate fill that entombed the enclosures, excavators recovered something unexpected, something that transformed the site from monument into occasion, from temple into gathering place, from abstraction into visceral immediate presence. They found bones, hundreds of thousands of them, animal bones, fragmented and scattered, mixed with stone tools and broken vessels and the debris of consumption, the remains of meals eaten not in private, not in households, not in the quiet repetition of domestic routine, but in spectacle, in abundance, in events that gathered dispersed bands and fed them together under open sky. The bones were not distributed evenly. They clustered in the fill, packed densely into the enclosures as part of the same deliberate act that buried the pillars, that closed the circles, that transformed Göbekli Tepe from active sight into memory. And their composition revealed something remarkable. Gazelle dominated the assemblage, accounting for more than 60% of the total, their bones shattered and splintered, marked with cut lines and fracture patterns consistent with systematic butchery, with marrow extraction, with intensive processing designed to extract every usable fragment of nutrition from the carcass. Alongside them, the bones of aurochs, the massive wild cattle that roam the plains and valleys of Upper Mesopotamia, there remains testimony to the killing and consumption of animals that weighed half a ton or more, that required coordinated hunting, multiple hunters working together to bring down prey too large and too dangerous for a single individual to manage alone. And wild boar, their bones scored and split, their presence evidence of hunts conducted in the forested margins of the region, in the riparian zones where pigs foraged and thrived, where the landscape offered cover and concealment, and the work of hunting demanded patience, skill, and risk. The sheer volume of bone was staggering. Excavations recovered over 100,000 fragments, and the site remains only partially explored. The full extent of the assemblage still buried beneath unexcavated fill, still waiting in the earth. The numbers suggested consumption on a scale incompatible with small mobile bands, incompatible with the day-to-day subsistence of a few dozen individuals moving across the landscape in seasonal circuits. The bones spoke of events, of gatherings, of occasions when the ridge was crowded, when hundreds of people converged on the limestone plateau and stayed long enough to slaughter, butcher, cook, and consume animals by the score, by the hundred, in quantities that exceeded immediate need, that spilled over into abundance, into display, into the social theatre of competitive generosity and obligation. Archaeozoologist Joris Peters, analysing the bone assemblage, identified patterns that deepened the mystery. The gazelle bones bore evidence of systematic processing, the long bones split to access marrow, the vertebrae separated, the skulls fractured to extract brain tissue, the carcasses reduced methodically, efficiently, with techniques honed by repetition and experience. But the scale of the operation exceeded anything associated with ordinary consumption. The bones were not the residue of meals eaten over weeks or months. They were the residue of feasts, of concentrated episodes of slaughter and consumption, of events that lasted days, perhaps, or a single overwhelming occasion, and then ended, leaving behind only the refuse, the broken bones packed into the fill alongside the limestone rubble and the flint tools and the other debris of ritual closure. The site contained stone vessels, large ones, limestone basins carved from single blocks, their interiors hollowed and smoothed, their capacities measured in tens of litres, in volumes sufficient to hold liquids in quantities far beyond individual use. 6 of these vessels, analysed by Oliver Dietrich and colleagues, yielded residues that changed the interpretation of Göbekli Tepe yet again. The chemical signatures were unmistakable. Calcium oxalate, a byproduct of fermentation, the crystalline deposit left behind when organic compounds break down in the presence of yeast, when sugars convert to alcohol, when grain or fruit transforms into something intoxicating, something sacred, something reserved for occasions when ordinary rules suspended and the boundaries between human and divine, between mundane and numinous, grew thin and permeable. The residues suggested beer, or something like it, a fermented beverage derived from wild cereals, from the grasses that grew on the slopes surrounding the ridge, that were harvested and processed and brewed in quantities sufficient to fill stone basins, holding up to 160 litres. Vessels designed not for storage but for serving, for distribution, for the communal act of drinking together, of sharing liquid that loosened tongues and dissolved inhibitions and made the night longer, the gathering louder, the bonds between participants stronger and more dangerous in equal measure. The site was dense with grinding stones, thousands of them. Mortars and pestles, flat stones worn smooth by repetition, tools designed for crushing and grinding, for reducing hard seeds to flour, for processing plant material in volumes that exceeded the needs of any single family or band. The concentration of grinding tools at Göbekli Tepe was extraordinary, unprecedented for a site with no permanent settlement, no domestic architecture, no evidence of year-round habitation. The tools were brought to the ridge, used intensively and left behind, their presence testimony to labour conducted on site, to the preparation of food and drink in quantities that matched the scale of the bone assemblage that supported the interpretation emerging from the archaeological record. Göbekli Tepe was not a village, it was not a town, it was a place people came to, periodically, in numbers large enough to demand coordination, organisation, and the mobilization of resources from across the surrounding landscape. It was a convergence point, a place of assembly, a site where dispersed hunter-gatherer bands gathered to feast, to perform rituals, to negotiate alliances, to compete for prestige, to display wealth and generosity, and the capacity to organize labor and martial resources on a scale otherwise invisible in the mobile egalitarian societies that dominated the Levantine Neolithic. Brian Hayden, an anthropologist at Simon Fraser University, proposed a framework for understanding Göbekli Tepe that resonated with the evidence accumulating in the backfill. He called it the feasting hypothesis. The idea was simple but radical. Monumental architecture, Hayden argued, did not emerge from agricultural surplus or the coercive power of centralized states. It emerged from competition, from the social ambitions of individuals and families operating within what he termed transegalitarian societies, communities that retained the mobile, kinship-based organization of hunter-gatherers, but had begun to develop mechanisms for accumulating and displaying prestige, for converting surplus labor and resources into social capital, into obligations and debts, and alliances that extended beyond immediate kin, that created networks of reciprocity spanning vast distances and multiple generations. In such societies, feasting was not celebration, it was strategy. It was the arena in which status was contested, where leaders emerged, where bonds were forged and tested, where the work of building coalitions and securing loyalty unfolded in the very public, very visible act of feeding people, of providing abundance, of demonstrating the capacity to organize and deliver on promises made. And the construction of monuments, the raising of pillars, the carving of reliefs, the creation of spaces designed to host gatherings and amplify their significance. These were extensions of the feast, material expressions of the same competitive dynamic, investments in prestige that paid dividends in influence, in followers, in the capacity to mobilize labor for future projects, future feasts, future displays. Göbekli Tepe fit the model. The enclosures were not habitations, they were stages, spaces designed for performance, for ritual, for the orchestration of events that drew participants from across the region and held them together long enough to carve memory, to create shared experience, to bind them to the ridge and to each other through participation in something extraordinary, something that exceeded the scale and intensity of ordinary life. The pillars anchored the space, marked it as special, as sacred, as worthy of the effort required to reach it, to contribute to it, to return. And the feasts provided the mechanism. The slaughter of gazelles and aurochs, the brewing of beer, the grinding of grain, the preparation of food in quantities that exceeded need, that created surplus, that allowed hosts to give more than guests could repay, to generate obligation, to secure loyalty, to position themselves at the center of networks that extended across hundreds of kilometers, that linked the ridge to distant valleys and plateaus and watersheds, that made Göbekli Tepe a node in a web of alliance and exchange and ritual participation, that shaped the social landscape of the pre-pottery Neolithic. The bones made the builders visible. They were no longer abstractions, no longer the anonymous architects of an impossible monument. They were people who ate and drank and gathered in numbers, large enough to leave behind a refuse heap measured in tons, who stood among the pillars and watched animals roasted over fires, who ground grain into flour and brewed it into beer and poured it into limestone basins and drank together, who sang or chanted or told stories or remained silent, awed by the occasion, by the presence of others, by the sheer improbability of so many people converging on a single limestone ridge in a world where mobility was survival, where bands split and reformed, where permanence was rare and gatherings were brief, and the work of sustaining large groups in one place for more than a few days strained the carrying capacity of even the richest landscapes. Göbekli Tepe was loud. It smelled of smoke and roasting meat and spilled beer and sweat and limestone dust, and the oils used to light the enclosures after dark, when firelight played across the carved reliefs, and the shadows moved, and the pillars seemed almost alive, almost animate, their faceless heads watching, their arms folded, their surfaces dense with animals that flickered in and out of visibility as the flames rose and fell. The ridge was not a place of quiet contemplation. It was a place of noise, of laughter and argument and song, of the clatter of stone tools and the scrape of grinding stones and the crack of bones being split for marrow, of the low murmur of conversation and the sudden shout of recognition when distant kin arrived, when bands reunited, when alliances renewed and obligations discharged and new debts incurred in the endless cycle of reciprocity that held the Neolithic world together. And yet the feasting raised as many questions as it answered. How did they sustain it? How did mobile hunter-gatherers, operating without agriculture, without domesticated animals, without permanent storage infrastructure, marshal the resources required to feed hundreds of people for days at a time, to slaughter gazelles by the dozen, to brew beer in quantities sufficient to fill stone basins, to grind grain in volumes that left thousands of grinding stones scattered across the site? The landscape was rich. The plains and valleys of Upper Mesopotamia supported dense populations of game, and the wild grasses that blanketed the hillsides provided abundant seed harvests in late spring and early summer. But richness was not surplus. Mobile societies exploited resources opportunistically, moving to follow seasonal abundance, never staying long enough in one place to exhaust local supplies, never accumulating stores beyond what could be carried. The demands of Göbekli Tepe were different. They required coordination across space and time, the aggregation of resources from multiple bands, the delivery of animals and grain and labour to the ridge in volumes that exceeded what any single group could provide, what any local area could sustain. The feasts were collective enterprises, joint investments, acts of cooperation that bound participants together, even as they competed for status and influence within the gathering. And the success of the feasts, the ability to sustain them year after year, generation after generation, across the centuries of Göbekli Tepe's active life, suggested something unprecedented in the Neolithic record. It suggested planning, coordination, social complexity on a scale that predated the institutions, the chiefs, the priests, the scribes, the centralized authorities. Historians had long assumed were necessary preconditions for such organization. The ridge was anarchic in structure but monumental in achievement, a paradox that refused to resolve, that left Göbekli Tepe suspended between worlds, between the mobile egalitarianism of the Paleolithic and the hierarchical sedentism of the Bronze Age, belonging fully to neither, pioneering something strange and unstable and ultimately unsustainable, a social experiment that flourished for 1,500 years and then ended, the enclosures buried, the feasts concluded, the ridge abandoned to silence. 30 kilometers to the northeast, clearly visible from the limestone plateau, rose the dark slopes of Karakada, a volcanic mountain whose basalt fields and ash-enriched soils supported dense stands of wild grass. In 1997, geneticist Manfred Huhn and colleagues published a study in Science that traced the domestication of einkorn wheat, one of the founder crops of Neolithic agriculture, to a single wild population growing on the flanks of Karakada. The identification was precise. DNA analysis of modern einkorn cultivars and wild einkorn populations across the Fertile Crescent revealed a genetic bottleneck, a single domestication event, a moment when humans began selecting seeds from wild grasses and planting them intentionally, generation after generation, until the plant's morphology shifted, its seeds larger, its shattering raches replaced by a tough raches that held seeds on the stalk long enough for harvest, its biology reshaped by human intention into something new, something that could not survive without cultivation, that depended on humans as much as humans came to depend on it. The wild ancestor of all domesticated einkorn wheat grew within sight of Göbekli Tepe. The proximity was too striking to ignore. Klaus Schmidt, in the years following Huhn's publication, began to argue for a reversal of causality, a reordering of the Neolithic narrative that placed ritual before subsistence, temple before farm, belief before bread. The conventional story held that agriculture came first, that surplus allowed leisure, that leisure enabled art and ritual and the construction of monuments, that religion was a luxury, a product of settled life, a consequence of the economic transformations wrought by farming. Schmidt rejected the sequence. He proposed instead that the drive to build, to gather, to construct monuments and host feasts and create spaces for ritual performance came first, that the social and symbolic revolution preceded the economic one, that the demands of Göbekli Tepe, feeding hundreds of participants, sustaining gatherings over days or weeks, returning year after year to the ridge, created pressures that could not be met by foraging alone, that required intentional cultivation, the deliberate planting and harvesting of wild grasses, the first tentative steps toward agriculture not as discovery but as necessity, as the only viable solution to the logistical problem posed by the feasts. Jacques Cauvin, a French archaeologist whose 1994 book The Birth of the Gods and the Origins of Agriculture became a foundational text for the symbolic revolution hypothesis, argued that the Neolithic was not an economic transition, but a cognitive one, a fundamental restructuring of human consciousness, a moment when people began to see the world differently, to imagine new relationships between humans and animals, between earth and sky, between the living and the dead, between the material and the immaterial. The shift, Cauvin proposed, was visible in art, in the sudden proliferation of symbolic imagery, in the appearance of anthropomorphic figures and animal reliefs, in the construction of spaces designed not for habitation but for ritual, for the enactment of beliefs that had no precedent in the Paleolithic, that reflected new cosmologies, new mythologies, new ways of organizing meaning and memory. And agriculture, Cauvin argued, followed from this cognitive shift. It was not the cause of the Neolithic but its consequence, the material expression of a worldview that saw humans as cultivators, as shapers of the landscape, as beings with the power and the responsibility to intervene in the natural world, to domesticate plants and animals, to transform wild into tame, chaos into order, nature into culture. Göbekli Tepe embodied the hypothesis. The pillars predated farming by 1,000 years or more, yet the site's proximity to Karahan, to the birthplace of domesticated wheat, suggested a connection, a relationship between the symbolic and the economic, between the ritual gatherings on the ridge and the slow tentative beginnings of cultivation on the slopes below. Were the people who built Göbekli Tepe also the people who domesticated wheat? Did the labour of feeding the feasts drive them to experiment with wild grasses, to plant seeds intentionally, to return to the same plots year after year, to select for traits that made harvesting easier, more predictable, more abundant? Did the temple create the farm? The evidence remains circumstantial. No domesticated wheat has been found at Göbekli Tepe itself. The site predates the morphological changes that distinguish cultivated einkorn from its wild ancestor, predates the full commitment to agriculture that defined the later pre-pottery Neolithic B. But the grinding stones were there. The infrastructure for processing grain in industrial quantities was in place centuries before agriculture became the dominant subsistence strategy, and the timeline fit. Göbekli Tepe's construction began around 9600 BCE. Domesticated einkorn appeared by 8500 BCE, within a few kilometres of the ridge. The overlap was suggestive. It hinted at causality, at a sequence in which the social and ritual innovations of the pre-pottery Neolithic A created conditions that necessitated agricultural intensification, that transformed foraging into cultivation, that turned the wild grasses on Karahan into the crops that would eventually spread across Eurasia and underpin every civilization that followed. The temple came first, the wheat came after, and the implications, if the hypothesis held, were profound. Agriculture was not an invention, it was a response, a solution to a problem created by the human drive to gather, to build, to create spaces of meaning and memory that exceeded the scale of everyday life, that demanded resources and labour and coordination beyond what mobile foraging could sustain. The Neolithic revolution was not a sudden insight, not a moment of genius, not a discovery made by a single individual who saw the potential in a stand of wild grass and changed the world. It was a slow, grinding pressure, a logistical necessity born from the feasts at Göbekli Tepe and the enclosures that hosted them, a consequence of decisions made for reasons that had nothing to do with food security or economic optimization, and everything to do with the imperatives of ritual, of prestige, of the social competition that drove trans-egalitarian societies to undertake projects that strained their capacity and redefined what was possible. And then, around 8000 BCE, the feasting stopped. The enclosures were filled in, deliberately, methodically. Thousands of tons of limestone rubble, quarried from the same sources that had provided material for the pillars, were hauled to the ridge and packed into the circular structures, layer by layer, until the pillars were buried, until the carved reliefs disappeared beneath stone and soil, until the spaces that had hosted gatherings for 15 centuries were closed, sealed, transformed from active sites into silent mounds, into memory, into ghosts. The fill was not random. It was not the result of natural collapse, of erosion or landslides, or the slow decay of abandoned structures. It was organised, homogeneous. The rubble mixed with flint tools and animal bones and the same grinding stones that had processed grain for the feasts, the same stone vessels that had held beer, the debris of ritual life packed into the enclosures as part of the same act that entombed them, that ended Göbekli Tepe's active phase and left the ridge empty, silent, waiting for Klaus Schmidt to arrive 9,000 years later and begin the work of excavation, of uncovering what had been so carefully buried. Schmidt never resolved the burial. He called it the most puzzling thing about the site, the central mystery that eluded every explanatory framework, every attempt to impose narrative coherence on the archaeological record. Why bury the enclosures? Why invest the labour required to fill them in, to erase the pillars from view, to close the spaces that had been the focus of so much effort, so much coordination, so much collective investment over so many generations? The act was deliberate, that much was clear, but its purpose remained opaque. Was it ritual closure, a formal decommissioning of sacred space, an acknowledgement that the time of the temple had ended and something new was beginning? Was it a response to social collapse, to the breakdown of the networks that had sustained the feasts, to the failure of the competitive dynamics that had driven the construction and maintenance of the enclosures? Was it environmental, a consequence of climate shifts or resource depletion? A recognition that the landscape could no longer support the gatherings, that the carrying capacity had been exceeded, that the experiment had failed? Or was it something else, something that fit none of these categories, something that required understanding the builders on their own terms, in their own cosmology, their own sense of time and obligation, and the proper relationship between humans and the spaces they created and the moments when those spaces had to end? Schmidt worked at Göbekli Tepe for 19 years. He devoted his career to the site, returned every summer to oversee excavations, trained a generation of archaeologists in the methods and interpretive frameworks required to make sense of the ridge, published prolifically, defended the site's significance against skeptics, and built the case for the symbolic revolution that had transformed the conventional narrative of the Neolithic. He estimated that only 5% of the site had been excavated by the time of his death. The pillars still standing in Enclosure D were only the beginning. Ground-penetrating radar suggested at least 16 additional circular structures buried beneath unexcavated fill, each one potentially as complex and richly decorated as those already uncovered, each one holding new carvings, new imagery, new clues to the meanings encoded in the stone. Schmidt believed the work would continue for decades, for generations, that Göbekli Tepe would remain an active excavation site for the rest of the 21st century, that future archaeologists would uncover details and patterns invisible to the first phase of exploration, that the ridge would yield its secrets slowly, reluctantly, one enclosure at a time. On July 20th, 2014, Klaus Schmidt died of a heart attack. He was 60 years old. He died far from the ridge, but his absence was felt there immediately, profoundly, as if something essential had been withdrawn from the site, as if the work of uncovering Göbekli Tepe and the life of the man who had led that work were bound together in ways that transcended professional obligation, that made Schmidt not just an archaeologist but a participant, a presence woven into the ridge's modern history as deeply as the Neolithic builders were woven into its ancient one. He had devoted his life to a question he could not answer. The burial remained unresolved. The pillars stayed silent. The mystery that had drawn him to the ridge in 1994, that had held him there for 19 years, that had shaped his career and his reputation and his understanding of the Neolithic, outlived him. It waits still, buried in the unexcavated fill, in the enclosures not yet opened, in the layers of rubble and bone and worked flint that cover the ridge and hold its secrets close, refusing to release them, refusing simplicity, refusing closure, waiting for the next generation of excavators to arrive and begin again the work of uncovering what was so carefully, so deliberately, so mysteriously buried 10,000 years ago, 10 kilometers southeast of Göbekli Tepe. Across a low valley and over a second ridge of pale limestone sits another hill. It rises from the same landscape, the same geological formation, the same weathered terrain of southeastern Turkey, where the Taurus foothills descend toward the Harran Plain. The local name for it is Kesili Tepe, Goat Hill, a name that speaks to centuries of pastoral use, to flocks grazing across slopes where carved stone lies half buried in the dirt, to shepherds who knew the place as unremarkable, as one more outcrop in a region full of outcrops, as a hill like any other. But it was not like any other. The stone pillars that marked its surface, visible at ground level for decades or longer, carried the same T-shaped profiles that had drawn Klaus Schmidt to Göbekli Tepe in 1994. They stood or leaned or lay broken across the ridge, weathered by wind and rain, ignored by most, noted by a few, waiting. The site was first formally documented in 1997 by Bahattin Çelik of Harran University during regional surface surveys, part of the systematic effort to map the pre-pottery Neolithic landscape of Şanlıurfa province following the revelations at Göbekli Tepe. Çelik recognized the pillars for what they were: monumental architecture from the 9th or 10th millennium BCE, evidence of another sanctuary, another ritual center, another node in the network of sacred sites that had begun to emerge across the upper Mesopotamian highlands. He catalogued the surface finds, photographed the exposed stonework, and noted the site's potential. Then the work paused. For more than 20 years, Karahan Tepe, Blackstone Hill, its formal archaeological designation, remained largely unexcavated. The pillars stood in their places, marking the ridge, hinting at what lay beneath, but the resources and attention required for full-scale excavation were absorbed elsewhere, by Göbekli Tepe, by other sites, by the constraints of funding and personnel and the sheer enormity of the task facing archaeologists, in a region where almost every ridge seemed to hold buried monuments from the dawn of settled life. The surface remained the extent of the evidence. The hill kept its secrets. It was not until 2019 that serious excavation began. Nesmi Karul of Istanbul University assumed directorship of the site as part of the Taş Tepeler project, the Stone Hills Initiative, a government-backed effort to investigate the full constellation of pre-pottery, Neolithic sanctuaries across southeastern Turkey, to move beyond the singular focus on Göbekli Tepe and recognize the interconnected nature of the landscape, the way these sites spoke to one another, drew from shared traditions, participated in a broader cultural and spiritual network whose extent was only now becoming visible. Karahan Tepe was one of 12 sites identified for systematic study. The first season of excavation made it clear that the hill was not a minor satellite, not a pale reflection of Göbekli Tepe's monumental ambition, but something comparable in scale and significance, possibly larger, possibly older, certainly different in ways that complicated and enriched the emerging picture of the pre-pottery Neolithic. The site covers approximately 14 hectares, nearly twice the area of Göbekli Tepe. Ground surveys and initial excavations identified more than 250 T-shaped pillars across the ridge, some standing, some fallen, some still partially buried in rubble and sediment, others carved directly into the living bedrock, their forms emerging from the stone itself rather than being quarried, transported, and erected as freestanding monuments. The construction technique was fundamentally distinct. Where Göbekli Tepe's builders had shaped limestone blocks in distant quarries and hauled them to the ridge to be set into circular enclosures built from stacked dry stone masonry, Karahan Tepe's builders had worked the bedrock in place, carving chambers and pillars and benches directly into the plateau, excavating downward into the limestone to create subterranean spaces, semi-enclosed sanctuaries hewn from the earth, rooms that felt less like constructed buildings and more like caves, like descents into the underworld, like passages into the body of the hill itself. The implications were immediate. The architectural difference suggested either a distinct tradition, a separate lineage of monumental construction running parallel to Göbekli Tepe's methods, or an evolution, a chronological shift in technique and intention that spoke to changing cosmologies, changing relationships between the builders and the stone, changing understandings of what a sanctuary should be and how it should relate to the land. The question of sequence remained unresolved. Was Karahan Tepe older than Göbekli Tepe, a predecessor whose carved bedrock tradition gave way to the freestanding pillars of the circular enclosures? Or was it younger, a successor that returned to the earth, that sought enclosure and concealment rather than the open sky and the encircling horizon that characterized Göbekli Tepe's great rings? Radiocarbon dating placed both sites within the same broad temporal window, the pre-pottery Neolithic A and B, roughly 9600 to 8000 BCE. but the resolution was not fine enough to establish clear priority, to say definitively which came first, which influenced the other, whether they were contemporary and coexisting, products of the same moment but different expressions of shared beliefs, or whether one was the answer to the other, a rejection or a refinement, or a return to older practices after an experimental divergence. The question hung in the air, unresolved, tantalizing, bound up with deeper uncertainties about how culture moved across this landscape, how ideas and techniques and iconographies travelled from ridge to ridge, from valley to valley, from one community of hunter-gatherers to another. But the most striking difference was not architectural, it was human. In 2021 and 2022, excavations at Karahan Tepe uncovered a chamber designated Structure AB, a semi-subterranean space carved into the bedrock, its walls and floor shaped by flint tools and abrasive stones into smooth, continuous surfaces. The chamber contained 11 pillars, phallus-shaped rather than T-shaped, rising from the floor in a loose ring around the room's periphery. The pillars were not the centerpiece. At the far end of the chamber, carved from the same bedrock, integrated into the wall so seamlessly that it appeared to be emerging from the stone itself, was a human head. It was life-sized, naturalistic, rendered with a precision and attention to anatomical detail that had no precedent at Göbekli Tepe, no parallel in the animal reliefs and abstract anthropomorphic forms that dominated the earlier site's iconography. The head was bald, or depicted with a shaved skull, the surface of the scalp smooth and rounded. The face was bearded, the stubble carved with fine, repetitive strokes that suggested the texture of hair, the roughness of skin, the specificity of an individual rather than an archetype. The eyes were deep-set, shadowed, the sockets hollowed out as if to receive inlays, obsidian perhaps, or shell, or bitumen, that would have given the figure a gaze, a presence, a capacity to look back at those who entered the chamber and stood before it. The mouth was closed, neutral, neither smiling nor frowning, the expression inscrutable, withheld, offering no clue to the emotion or intention behind the face. A low-relief serpent ran along the wall beside the head, its body sinuous, coiling across the stone as if guarding the figure, or accompanying it, or emerging from the same source. Nekmi Karul, describing the head in preliminary reports, said it appeared to be a person being born from the earth, or being consumed by it. The ambiguity was essential. The head did not sit atop a body, did not rest on shoulders or emerge from a neck. It rose directly from the bedrock, as if the stone were giving birth, as if the figure were ascending from below, or as if it were sinking, being pulled down into the hill, the face the last thing visible before it disappeared entirely. The image was liminal, suspended between emergence and disappearance, between presence and absence, between the world of the living and the world beneath the surface. It was impossible to say which direction the movement implied, whether the head was coming or going, whether the chamber was a place of birth or death or transformation. Standing in that space, one could not help but feel the weight of the stone above, the mass of the ridge pressing down, the sense that the chamber was not a room, but a threshold, a boundary between realms, a place where the separation between human and earth, between animate and inanimate, between self and stone, dissolved. In 2022, excavators uncovered a second figure, this one a full-body statue carved in the same naturalistic style, seated in a niche carved into another part of the site. The figure was 2.3 meters tall, larger than life, its proportions exaggerated but recognizably human. The head was bald, the ribs and spine carved in deep relief, the bones visible beneath the skin, the body depicted with an anatomical clarity that suggested intimate familiarity with the human form, with the way muscle and bone articulate beneath flesh, the way the skeleton shapes the surface. The hands were clasped at the front of the body, the fingers interlaced, the posture formal, deliberate, as if the figure were holding something invisible, or restraining something, or protecting something. The genitals were explicit, the phallus rendered without ambiguity, the maleness of the figure unmistakable. The statue was seated in a purpose-built niche, the stone around it carved to frame the figure, to focus attention, to create a space within a space, a shrine within the chamber, a focal point that drew the eye and held it. These were not the abstract beings of Göbekli Tepe, the faceless T-shaped pillars with their carved belts and empty surfaces. These were individuals, They had features, expressions, bodies rendered with enough specificity to suggest portraiture, to imply that the carvers were working from observation, from memory, from a desire to capture not just the idea of a human, but the reality of one, the particularity of a face, a posture, a presence. The shift was profound. At Göbekli Tepe, the human form had been subordinated to the animals, to the foxes and boars and vultures that populated the pillars' surfaces, to the abstract symbols, crescents, H-shapes, handbags that hinted at meanings inaccessible to modern interpretation. The T-shaped pillars were anthropomorphic, yes, but only barely. Their humanity implied by belts and arms carved in low relief, their faces absent, their individuality erased in favour of a generalised, idealised, perhaps divine form. At Karahan Tepe, the human had moved to the centre. The animals were still present, serpents carved along walls, other reliefs emerging as excavation continued, but they no longer dominated. The focus had shifted. The builders of Karahan Tepe were interested in the human body, the human face, the human figure as subject and symbol, as worthy of monumental representation, as deserving of the same labour and attention that had been devoted to the menagerie at Göbekli Tepe. What had changed? Was it chronology, a temporal shift that saw the human gradually displace the animal in the symbolic vocabulary of the pre-pottery Neolithic, a movement toward anthropocentrism that would culminate in the agricultural settlements of later millennia? Was it geography, a difference in belief systems between the communities who built Göbekli Tepe and those who carved Karahan Tepe, a divergence in cosmology that reflected distinct lineages, distinct oral traditions, distinct relationships to the land and the ancestors and the forces that governed life and death? Or was it function, the possibility that Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe served different purposes within the same ritual landscape, that one was a place for communal gatherings, for feasts and public ceremonies conducted under the open sky, while the other was a place for descent, for private or initiatory rites conducted in the enclosed, carved chambers beneath the surface, spaces where the human confronted the earth directly, face to face, body to stone, life to death. The evidence could not yet settle the question, but the presence of the naturalistic heads and statues at Karahan Tepe forced a reconsideration of the narrative that had emerged from Göbekli Tepe, the story of a pre-agricultural society organised around animal symbolism, around the menagerie, around the wild species that populated the landscape and provided sustenance and danger and meaning. Karahan Tepe suggested that the story was more complex, that the human had always been present, always central, even if expressed differently, even if rendered in forms and contexts that had not survived or had not yet been uncovered at the earlier excavations. The builders of these sanctuaries were not anonymous. They had faces. They looked back. 60 kilometres to the east, near the modern village of Sayburç in Şanlıurfa province, another site added a different dimension to the emerging picture. Sayburç had been identified through surface finds and local reports. T-shaped pillars repurposed in village garden walls, carved stones incorporated into modern structures, the telltale signs of an older buried settlement visible at ground level to those who knew what to look for. Excavations led by Aylem Özdoğan of Istanbul University began in 2021, part of the same Taştepeler initiative that had brought resources and attention to Karahan Tepe and the broader network of pre-pottery Neolithic sites. The site dated to the 9th millennium BCE, contemporary with Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, part of the same cultural horizon, the same explosion of monumental architecture and symbolic expression that had transformed the Upper Mesopotamian highlands during the 1,000-year window between 9600 and 8600 BCE. Sayburç contained multiple structures, both residential and communal, evidence of a more permanent settlement than had been found at Göbekli Tepe, a suggestion that some of these sites were not purely ritual centres, but places where people lived, worked, built households, sustained themselves year-round rather than gathering seasonally for feasts and ceremonies. The architecture was familiar, circular or oval buildings carved into bedrock, stone benches running along interior walls, T-shaped pillars integrated into the design. But one structure stood apart. Structure AA, a communal building roughly 12 metres in diameter, featured a bench that ran along the interior wall, its inward-facing surface carved with a continuous relief scene. The scene was narrative. It was not a collection of isolated symbols not a menagerie of unrelated animals, not the stacked, overlapping imagery that characterized Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe, where scorpions and vultures and handbags coexisted without clear syntactic relationship, without a story to bind them. The Sayburç relief was compositional. It depicted 5 figures, 2 humans, 2 leopards, and a bull, arranged in 2 adjacent panels that read horizontally, left to right, as if the carver had understood sequence, had intended the viewer to follow the scene from one end to the other, to perceive the relationship between the figures not just spatially, but temporally, as moments in a narrative, as events connected by causality or ritual logic. The central figure was a male human, carved in high relief, the only figure rendered in 3 dimensions, depicted in a seated position with knees bent, his right hand grasping his phallus. He was flanked by 2 leopards, their bodies shown in profile, their mouths open, teeth visible, the posture predatory or threatening or perhaps simply attentive, witnesses to the human figure's act. The second panel showed another male figure, this one in flat relief, squatting slightly, facing a bull, holding what appeared to be a serpent or a rattle in one hand. The 2 scenes were distinct but adjacent, separated by minimal space, the proximity suggesting connection, suggesting that the viewer was meant to read them together, to understand the bull and the leopards and the serpent as participants in a single story, a single mythological or ritual moment captured in stone. The Sayburç relief is the earliest known narrative sculpture in human history. It predates the painted scenes of Çatalhöyük by more than a millennium, predates the cylinder seals of Mesopotamia by 3,000 years, predates the hieroglyphic sequences of Egypt by 5,000. It is the first time humans took the symbolic vocabulary they had developed, the animals, the human figures, the ritual postures, and organized them into syntax, into a grammar of relationship and sequence that allowed the stone to tell a story rather than simply mark a presence. The implications were staggering. Narrative requires abstraction, the capacity to think in terms of before and after, cause and effect, the ability to encode events in a medium that exists outside time, that allows the past to be represented, reenacted, re-experienced by those who were not present when the events occurred. It requires a theory of mind sophisticated enough to understand that viewers will bring their own interpretive frameworks to the scene, that the story must be legible across individual perspectives, that the symbols must carry shared meanings stable enough to communicate across the gap between carver and audience. It requires, in other words, language, not necessarily written language, but symbolic language, a system of representation capable of expressing relationships, actions, intentions, the complex web of meaning that binds humans to one another and to the world they inhabit. The Sayburç relief suggested that the builders of the pre-pottery Neolithic sanctuaries were not just marking sacred space, not just creating environments for ritual or feasting or communal gatherings. They were encoding knowledge. They were creating texts, visual texts, carved into stone, fixed in place, designed to endure, designed to be read by those who entered the space and stood before the bench and traced the figures with their eyes, and reconstructed the story, the myth, the cosmological truth that the scene was meant to convey. What was the story? The leopards and the snake and the bull and the 2 male figures holding their phalluses, what did they mean? Was it a myth of origins, a creation story, an account of the first humans and their relationship to the animals that shared the land? Was it a ritual instruction, a guide to ceremonies that required the participants to assume specific postures, to invoke specific animals, to perform specific acts in a prescribed sequence? Was it a historical record, a commemoration of an actual event, a hunt, a confrontation, a moment of transformation, elevated to mythological significance? Or was it something else, something that fit none of these categories, something that required understanding the builder's cosmology from the inside, their sense of what mattered, what needed to be remembered, what needed to be carved into stone so that it would not be forgotten? The answers were not available. The scene resisted easy interpretation. The leopards' open mouths could signify threat or speech or transformation. The human figure's grasp of their phalluses could signify fertility or power, or ritual purity or defiance or submission. The bull and the serpent carried their own dense networks of symbolic association, strength, fertility, danger, rebirth, the chthonic, the celestial, the boundary between life and death. But which associations were active here? Which meanings the carvers intended? Which readings would have been obvious to the Neolithic viewers who stood in this chamber 11,000 years ago remained inaccessible, locked in the cultural context that had produced the scene and vanished with the people who created it? But the fact of the narrative, the existence of the story, was itself a revelation. These people thought in stories. They organized experience into sequences. They understood that stone could hold memory, that a carved surface could speak across time, that the work of the hand could encode the work of the mind, that the world they inhabited, its animals, its dangers, its mysteries, its meanings, could be captured, fixed, transmitted to those who came after. Göbekli Tepe was not an anomaly. It was not a singular flowering of genius, not an isolated monument built by a single community in a single moment of inspiration. It was one node in a network, one expression of a broader cultural efflorescence that stretched across the upper Mesopotamian highlands, linking ridge to ridge, valley to valley, community to community, sanctuary to sanctuary. Karahan Tepe, with its carved heads and subterranean chambers, its focus on the human form, its descent into the earth. Sayburç, with its narrative reliefs, its encoded stories, its earliest syntax of stone. And others, still being uncovered, still emerging from decades of neglect and oversight, from the long shadow cast by Göbekli Tepe's singular fame. Each site added detail, nuance, complexity to the picture. Each site raised new questions, opened new mysteries, refused simplicity. The people who built these sanctuaries were not primitives. They were not transition figures, not awkward intermediates caught between the mobile, egalitarian simplicity of Paleolithic hunter-gatherers and the settled, hierarchical complexity of Neolithic agriculturalists. They were fully human, fully modern in cognition and creativity, capable of monumental architecture, naturalistic sculpture, narrative composition, symbolic abstraction, collective coordination, on a scale that rivaled or exceeded the achievements of later civilizations. They thought deeply, they carved beautifully, they told stories, and then they stopped. Around 8000 BCE, the sanctuaries were closed, buried, sealed beneath rubble and fill, their pillars hidden, their chambers entombed, their stories interrupted. The network that had sustained them, whatever it was, whatever beliefs or obligations or kinship ties, had drawn people across the highlands to these specific ridges, to these specific carved chambers and monumental enclosures, dissolved. The knowledge that had guided the construction, the carving, the ritual use of these spaces, faded. The tradition ended. And for 8,000 years the hills kept their secrets, waiting in silence for the moment when the ground would be disturbed again, when the stone would be uncovered, when the faces carved into the bedrock would look up at new viewers, across an unbridgeable gulf of time, and ask questions no one was left to answer. Yet even as the great sanctuaries fell silent, even as the pillars were buried and the carved chambers sealed, life did not stop. Communities continued. People were born, grew, laboured, loved, died. And they were buried with care, with reverence, with objects that spoke of identity, status, connection. 60 kilometres southeast of Göbekli Tepe, at the eastern edge of what was emerging as a coherent cultural zone, lies a site that shifts the register from the monumental to the intimate, from the collective to the individual, from stone pillars rising against the sky to small, carefully drilled beads resting against human bone. The site is called Boncuklu Tarla, the beaded field, and it has yielded more than 100,000 ornaments, more personal adornment in a single pre-pottery Neolithic site than had been documented anywhere else in the region. The beads were not scattered randomly across the mound. They were not lost, discarded, forgotten. They were found in graves, threaded into belts and bracelets and necklaces, pressed against ribs and wrists and spines, surrounding the dead in constellations of stone and shell and bone and copper. Thousands of tiny objects per burial, each one shaped by hand, drilled with obsidian points or flint awls, strung with organic cord that had long since decayed, leaving only the beads themselves, the hard evidence of care, the material trace of what mattered. Boncuklu Tarla lies in the Dargasit district of Mardin province, in the rain shadow of the Taurus foothills, where the land begins its long descent toward the Tigris Valley and the plains of Upper Mesopotamia. It was discovered in 2008, identified as a low mound covering approximately 2.5 hectares, its surface littered with worked stone and bone fragments that suggested long habitation. Formal excavations began in 2012 under the direction of Ergül Kodaş of Mardin Artuklu University, and within the first seasons it became clear that this was not another sanctuary, not another monumental enclosure built for collective ritual. Boncuklu Tarla was a settlement, a place where people had lived continuously for more than 3,000 years, from the late Epipaleolithic, around 10,300 BCE, through the pre-pottery Neolithic B, ending only around 700 BCE, when the site was abandoned and its inhabitants dispersed. The architecture followed the expected trajectory. Earlier structures were circular, semi-subterranean, simple shelters dug into the earth with stone footings and organic roofs. Over centuries, the plans became more complex, more rectangular, more compartmentalized, evolving into multi-room houses with interior divisions, storage spaces, plastered floors made from crushed clay and burnt lime pressed smooth, a type of terrazzo that would not be formalized in Mediterranean architecture for millennia. One structure, dated to the earliest levels, stood apart in scale and ambition, a circular building approximately 10 meters in diameter, supported by stone pillars, its floor paved, its walls rising higher than the domestic structures that surrounded it. It was a public building, a communal space, an echo of the monumental tradition visible at Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, a reminder that even in settlements, even in the context of daily domestic life, there remained places set aside for something else, something collective, something sacred. But it was the burials that defined the site. More than 200 skeletons had been unearthed by the time the excavations reached their second decade, most interred beneath the plastered floors of residential houses, a practice common across the pre-pottery Neolithic world, the placement of the dead within the living space, beneath the hearth, beneath the threshold, beneath the place where feet passed daily, where the boundary between past and present, ancestor and descendant dissolved into the fabric of the home itself. The bodies were placed in flexed positions, knees drawn to chest, hands near the face, wrapped in organic materials that had left no trace beyond discoloration in the soil and slight disturbances in the bone arrangement, and they were adorned, heavily, lavishly, obsessively. Some graves contained a few dozen beads, others contained hundreds, several contained thousands. One burial, an adult male interred in the later phases of the settlement, held more than 3,000 individual ornaments. Beads of serpentine, limestone, chlorite, sandstone, obsidian, bone, phosphate, malachite, native copper, strung in complex patterns that suggested belts, multiple necklaces, bracelets on both wrists, possibly anklets, possibly a headdress. The exact configuration uncertain because the organic cords had decayed and the beads had collapsed into the grave fill, but the sheer quantity, the density, the variety of materials spoke unambiguously of wealth, status, identity, the projection of self that extended beyond death, beyond the body, into the ornamental envelope that surrounded it. The beads were not uniform, they were not mass-produced. Each one was individually shaped, ground smooth, drilled with painstaking precision, using stone tools that left spiral marks inside the boreholes, evidence of the rotation, the pressure, the hours required to pierce a single piece of hard stone. The obsidian beads were smallest, blackest, polished to a mirror finish. The serpentine beads were green, mottled, cool to the touch even after millennia in the soil. The copper beads were soft, reddish, corroded, their surfaces oxidized into verdigris crusts. But beneath the corrosion the metal remained ductile, workable, the earliest systematic use of copper yet documented in the region. More than 3,500 copper items had been recovered from Boncuklu Tarla, and of those 500 showed evidence of deliberate thermal alteration. Annealing, the controlled heating and cooling of the metal to increase its malleability, to allow it to be hammered, bent, shaped without cracking. A technique that required understanding the material, experimenting with fire temperatures, recognizing the transformation point where copper softened and became plastic. This was not smelting. The copper was native, not extracted from ore, and the temperatures achieved were not high enough to liquefy the metal. But it was metallurgy, proto-metallurgy, the beginning of a relationship with materials that would define human technology for the next 10,000 years. And then there were the shells, small, white, spiraled shells, drilled through the apex, threaded alongside the stone and copper beads, their surfaces worn smooth by handling, by movement, by friction against skin and cloth. The shells were marine, identified as species native to the Mediterranean coast, more than 200 kilometers to the southwest, across the Taurus Mountains, across river valleys and upland plateaus and terrain that was rugged, pathless, unforgiving. Someone had walked that distance. Someone had carried those shells inland, or traded for them through intermediaries, passing the objects hand to hand across the highlands, from coastal foragers to inland hunter-gatherers, from community to community, along exchange networks that were invisible in the archaeological record except for these small, durable traces, these objects that spoke of connection, of contact, of worlds that extended far beyond the boundaries of a single settlement, a single valley, a single ritual ridge. The shells were not rare at Boncuklu Tarla. They appeared in multiple graves, in multiple phases, suggesting that access to distant materials, to exotic ornaments, was not restricted to a single elite, not monopolized by chiefs or shamans or ritual specialists, but distributed across the community, available to many, valued by all. But availability did not mean equality. Some burials held a few shells, others held dozens. Some individuals were buried with simple bead belts, others were buried with layered necklaces, bracelets, ornaments sewn into their clothing, their hair, their burial shrouds, the density of adornment marking them as different, as special, as occupying a social position that required display, that demanded recognition, that could not be allowed to dissolve into anonymity even in death. The most striking evidence of differentiation came not from the quantity of beads but from the presence of labrets. Lip ornaments, small plugs or studs inserted through perforations in the lower lip, worn habitually, visibly, marking the wearer as distinct. Labrets had been found in situ in adult burials, positioned near the mandible, and the lower incisors of those individuals showed characteristic wear patterns, grooves eroded into the enamel by years of contact with the ornament. Proof that these were not funerary gifts placed with the dead, but objects worn in life, part of the living body, part of the social identity projected into the community. Labrets were absent from child burials. They appeared only in adults, suggesting they functioned as markers of maturity, of initiation, of passage into full social standing. The perforation itself was significant. It required deliberate modification of the body, piercing the flesh, inserting the ornament, enduring the pain and the healing, the permanent alteration that could not be undone, that marked the individual irreversibly as part of a specific tradition, a specific community, a specific identity. Boncuklu Tarla yielded the earliest evidence of body perforation yet documented in Southwest Asia, the first instance of humans deliberately altering their physical form not through scarification or tattooing, which left no skeletal trace, but through the insertion of permanent ornaments, through the transformation of the body into a surface for display, for meaning, for communication. The beads, the labrets, the shells, the copper, all of it spoke to something the older narrative had refused to acknowledge. These were not primitives. They were not crude, undifferentiated bands of mobile foragers struggling at the edge of subsistence, their lives consumed by the immediate demands of survival, their social structures flat, egalitarian, simple. They were individuals. They had identities. They had status, wealth, prestige, roles that were recognized, contested, displayed. They cared about appearance, about self-presentation, about how they were seen by others and how they would be remembered after death. They invested enormous labor, hours, days, weeks, in the creation of ornaments that served no utilitarian function, that did not make hunting easier or shelter more secure or food more abundant. But that mattered nonetheless, that mattered profoundly, because they encoded something essential about what it meant to be human, to be part of a community, to project oneself into the social world and to be recognized, acknowledged, valued. The primitive nomad, the faceless Paleolithic wanderer of the old textbooks, dissolved entirely at Boncuklu Tarla. What remained was complexity, nuance, richness, the unmistakable presence of fully modern human cognition and emotion, expressed not in monuments or sanctuaries, but in small, personal, intimate objects that rested against bone and spoke across millennia of care, of love, of grief, of the refusal to let the dead vanish into oblivion without marking their passage, without surrounding them with beauty, with meaning, with the material proof that they had lived, that they had mattered, that they would not be forgotten. 75 kilometers northwest, near the town of Ergani in Diyarbakır province, lies a site that spans the transformation. Çayönü Tepesi was first identified in 1963, during the same regional survey that had initially dismissed Göbekli Tepe as a medieval cemetery, and excavations began the following year under the joint direction of Halit Chambel of Istanbul University and Robert Braidwood of the University of Chicago, the American archaeologist whose work in the Fertile Crescent had helped define the Neolithic revolution as a coherent research problem. Braidwood was searching for the origins of agriculture, the moment when wild plants became domesticated, when human communities shifted from foraging to farming, and Çayönü, situated in the Ergani plain at the edge of the zone where wild wheat and barley grew naturally, seemed promising. The excavations continued for 16 seasons through 1991, and they revealed something more complicated than a simple agricultural origin story. They revealed a process, a transition, a slow, uneven, multi-generational transformation that unfolded over 2,000 years, from approximately 10,200 BCE to 7,000 BCE, spanning the pre-pottery Neolithic A, the pre-pottery Neolithic B, and the earliest pottery Neolithic, documenting in stratigraphic detail the architectural, economic, technological, and ritual changes that accompanied the shift from mobile hunter-gatherer life to settled agricultural existence. The site's stratigraphy was deep, complex, meticulously recorded, divided into 6 successive building subphases, each representing a distinct architectural tradition, a distinct way of organizing space, a distinct approach to construction and habitation. The earliest phase, the round plan phase, resembled the circular structures at Boncuklu Tarla, simple, semi-subterranean shelters with stone footings and organic superstructures, the architecture of mobility, of people still moving seasonally, still tethered to the rhythms of wild resources, still unwilling or unable to invest in permanent durable housing. Then came the grill plan phase, dated to approximately 8200 to 7500 BCE, and here the architecture changed fundamentally. The buildings were rectangular now, not circular, and their foundations consisted of parallel linear stone walls low, no more than 15 centimeters high, set into shallow trenches, creating a grid, a grill, that supported an elevated floor. The design was ingenious, practical, a response to the problem of moisture, of groundwater seeping into earthen floors, of mold and damp and rot that plagued structures built directly on the soil. The grill foundations allowed air to circulate beneath the floor, keeping it dry, ventilated, habitable year-round, enabling permanent occupation, enabling the accumulation of goods, the storage of surplus, the investment in place that defined sedentism. The next phase introduced channeled foundations, stone-lined drains running beneath the floors, directing water away from the living spaces, a further refinement, a further commitment to permanence. Then came cobble-paved floors, then cell-plan buildings with multiple small rooms clustered around a central space, then large room structures with wide, open interiors, the architecture evolving, complexifying, responding to changing needs, changing social structures, changing economies, the slow, patient negotiation between tradition and innovation that characterized the entire Neolithic transition. But Çayönü was not just a domestic settlement. It contained public buildings, communal structures, spaces set apart from the daily rhythm of household life. One such building, excavated in the grill plan phase, featured a floor made of burnished lime terrazzo, polished smooth, its surface gleaming, the labour required to create it immense. Tons of limestone had to be quarried, crushed, burned in kilns to produce quicklime, mixed with water and aggregate, spread across the floor, compacted, burnished, a process requiring coordination, specialised knowledge, sustained collective effort. 2 carved limestone stelae stood within the building, vertical markers, their surfaces blank or weathered beyond recognition, their presence alone sufficient to mark the space as significant, as different, as sacred. This was the terrazzo building, and its function remained uncertain, but its construction left no doubt that the community valued it, invested in it, maintained it across generations. And then there was the other building, the one that resisted easy naming, the one that carried no clear domestic function, no storage jars, no grinding stones, no hearths, no debris of daily life, but instead contained something else, something that forced a confrontation with what sacred meant to these people, what ritual entailed, what the boundary between the living and the dead actually looked like in practice. The structure was rectangular, approximately 7 meters by 8, built and rebuilt across multiple phases, its walls thick, its construction careful, deliberate, enduring. It had a rounded apse at one end and 2 small antechambers, and within those chambers, arranged on stone benches and platforms, were human skulls. Dozens of them, more than 70 documented, and alongside them, long bones, femurs and tibias, disarticulated, separated from the bodies they had once supported, carefully placed, deliberately positioned. The remains of the dead brought into this space, stored here, curated here, kept close, kept present, refused the finality of burial, refused the separation that death imposed. This was the skull building, the House of the Dead, and it contained the skeletal remains of at least 400 individuals, men and women and children, their bones mingled, their identities merged, their presence overwhelming. The skulls sat in rows, arranged along stone benches like witnesses to the living, like participants in an unending assembly. Their empty sockets turned toward the centre of the room, toward the space where the community gathered, where rituals were performed, where the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin, permeable, negotiable. The long bones rested alongside them, femurs and tibias stripped of flesh, cleaned, whitened by time and sun, their placement careful, intentional, suggesting not disposal but curation, not abandonment but care, the kind of attention one gives to objects of value, objects that carry meaning, objects that must be preserved, must be kept close, must remain accessible. The building had been used for generations, rebuilt multiple times across several architectural phases, its walls thickened, its floor resurfaced, its function unchanged, its purpose enduring through centuries of cultural and economic transformation, through the slow shift from hunting to herding, from wild grains to cultivated fields, from seasonal camps to permanent villages. And yet the skulls remained, generation after generation, the ancestors refusing to leave, the living refusing to let them go. Çayönü was not unique in this practice. Similar structures, similar assemblages of disarticulated skulls and long bones had been found at other Neolithic sites across the region, at Çatalhöyük, at Ain Ghazal, at Jericho, where plastered skulls had been recovered from beneath house floors, their features reconstructed in plaster, their eyes inlaid with shell, their faces restored, their identities preserved in a form that bridged the gap between flesh and stone, between person and ancestor, between memory and presence. The practice suggested a worldview in which death was not an ending but a transformation, in which the dead retained agency, retained importance, retained a claim on the living, a voice in communal affairs, a presence that demanded acknowledgement, demanded ritual, demanded the investment of labour and care and reverence that the skull building embodied. Standing within that structure, one could not escape the feeling that the dead were still there, still watching, still part of the community, still woven into the fabric of daily life in ways that modern funerary practice, with its emphasis on closure and separation and finality, could not easily comprehend. The skull cult, as archaeologists came to call it, was not an aberration but a pattern, a thread running through the pre-pottery Neolithic, connecting Çayönü to Göbekli Tepe, to Boncuklu Tarla, to Karahan Tepe, to the dozens of other sites scattered across the highlands of southeastern Turkey, sites that shared architectural traditions, shared symbolic grammars, shared rituals, shared beliefs, sites that together formed not isolated dots on a map but a network, a cultural landscape, a region bound by common practice and common understanding, a sacred geography that stretched across thousands of square kilometres and endured for more than a millennium. For decades, Göbekli Tepe had stood alone in scholarly imagination, an anomaly, an outlier, the single extraordinary exception that defied the rules. But the discovery and excavation of these other sites had shifted the frame, had revealed that Göbekli Tepe was not alone, was not singular, was part of something larger, something coherent, something that demanded a different kind of explanation, a different kind of story. In 2021, the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism formalised that recognition by launching the Taş Tepeler project, the Stone Hills Project, a coordinated multi-university survey and excavation programme targeting at least 12 sites across the Şanlıurfa region that shared the architectural and symbolic characteristics of the Göbekli Tepe tradition. The project brought together researchers from Istanbul University, Ankara University, Dikili University, Harran University, and institutions abroad, pooling expertise in archaeology, geophysics, archaeobotany, zooarchaeology, digital mapping, and conservation. Professor Necmi Karul, who had directed excavations at both Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, led the initiative, overseeing a research network that by 2025 included more than 200 scholars from 36 academic institutions across Turkey, the United Kingdom, Germany, Japan, and Italy. The scale of the undertaking was unprecedented, the ambition immense, the implications staggering. Ground-penetrating radar surveys, flux-gate magnetometry, and drone-mounted LiDAR scans swept across the region, mapping subsurface anomalies, detecting buried walls, identifying unexcavated enclosures, revealing that the excavated areas at Göbekli Tepe, at Karahan Tepe, at Sayburç, at Boncuklu Tarla, represented only a small fraction of what lay beneath the surface, perhaps 5%, perhaps less. The visible architecture merely the tip of a buried world that extended outward in every direction. Vast, interconnected, astonishingly sophisticated, the survey revealed sites that had not yet been named, mounds that had been dismissed as natural formations, ridges that concealed circular structures identical to those at Göbekli Tepe, T-shaped pillars still buried beneath meters of accumulated soil and stone, their surfaces carved with animals and symbols that no modern eye had yet seen, their meanings locked in darkness, waiting. Harbetsuvan Tepesi, 7 kilometers from Karahan Tepe and 35 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe, contained monumental architecture visible even from the surface, limestone pillars protruding from the hillside, their tops weathered but unmistakable, their arrangement suggesting enclosures, suggesting ritual space, suggesting that the network extended even farther than the excavated sites had indicated. Kurtepesi, Çakmaktepe, Taşlıtepe, Ayanlar, Yoğunburç, Göbekli Yeni Mahalle, names that appeared on survey maps, coordinates that marked the locations of unexcavated mounds, sites that would require decades of excavation to understand fully, sites that together painted a picture not of isolated monuments, but of a monumental building culture, a society capable of organising labour on a regional scale, of sustaining belief systems complex enough to demand the construction of massive stone sanctuaries, of maintaining those sanctuaries across centuries, of coordinating the movement of people and resources across distances that should have been prohibitive for hunter-gatherers, for mobile bands, for communities without agriculture, without domesticated animals, without the surplus that was supposed to be the precondition for everything that followed. The Taş Tepeler project had revealed a Neolithic landscape, a sacred geography, a network of sites connected by shared architecture, shared iconography, shared ritual practice, a cultural sphere that covered an area of approximately 200 kilometers east to west, a region unified not by political authority. There was no evidence of centralized rule, no palaces, no fortifications, no administrative bureaucracy, but by belief, by shared cosmology, by participation in a ritual system that drew dispersed communities together, that gave meaning to the labour invested in carving pillars and building enclosures, that provided the framework within which identity and belonging were negotiated, within which the living and the dead remained in conversation, within which the boundary between human and animal, between earth and sky, between the known and the unknown could be crossed, could be ritually traversed, could be made permeable. And that revelation forced a reckoning. The audience had been watching what appeared to be one extraordinary sight, then a handful, and now understood it was looking at the partial remains of a civilization, a word fraught, contested, but unavoidable, a civilization that had flourished in the pre-pottery Neolithic, that had built monuments before it built houses, that had carved gods before it planted seeds, that had organised society around sacred centres rather than agricultural surplus, and that had done so not briefly, not as an experiment, not as a fleeting anomaly, but for more than 1,500 years, across dozens of sites, involving tens of thousands of people, spanning generations upon generations, a cultural tradition so deep, so enduring, so coherent, that its collapse, its abandonment, its deliberate burial around 8000 BCE demanded explanation, demanded a story that could account for its ending as much as its beginning. But what did it mean? What were these places for? The question had haunted the excavations from the start, and despite decades of research, despite thousands of artifacts recovered, despite the careful mapping of enclosures and the meticulous analysis of animal bones and plant remains and stone tools, the question remained unresolved, contested, open, a space where competing interpretations collided, where scholarly frameworks struggled to contain the complexity of the evidence, where the mystery deepened rather than clarified. Klaus Schmidt, who had directed the excavations at Göbekli Tepe from 1996 until his death in 2014, had proposed the site as a temple, a sanctuary, a sacred centre where dispersed hunter-gatherer bands gathered periodically to perform rituals, to renew social bonds, to honour ancestors, to participate in ceremonies that were the central organising force of their society. He had called it the world's first temple, had argued that religion preceded agriculture, that ideology drove economic transformation, that belief compelled the shift from mobility to settlement, from foraging to farming, from a world of wild abundance to a world of cultivated order. The temple-first hypothesis had upended the conventional narrative of the Neolithic revolution, had challenged the materialist orthodoxy that placed agriculture at the root of all social complexity, and had become the dominant interpretation, the story told in museums and documentaries and textbooks, the frame through which Göbekli Tepe was understood. But others disagreed. Brian Hayden, an anthropologist at Simon Fraser University, had proposed a different reading, one grounded in ethnographic studies of trans-egalitarian societies, of competitive feasting, of aggrandizers and prestige economies, of social systems in which power was negotiated not through coercion, but through generosity, through the ability to host feasts to provide food and drink and spectacle, to demonstrate wealth and influence by giving it away, by creating obligation, by binding followers through ritual participation and shared consumption. Hayden looked at the evidence from Göbekli Tepe, the massive accumulations of animal bones, the grinding stones, the stone vessels with fermentation residues suggesting beer production, and saw not a temple, but a feasting hall, a venue for competitive displays, a place where ambitious individuals or lineages organised large-scale gatherings to build alliances, to recruit labour, to assert status, to create and maintain the social networks that made monumental construction possible in the first place. The pillars were not gods, but monuments to the hosts, to the organisers, to the aggrandizers who commanded the resources and the social capital necessary to carve and erect them. The animals were not sacred symbols, but displays of hunting prowess, of access to wild game, of the abundance that the host could provide. The ritual was not worship but performance, not devotion but politics, the sacred inseparable from the social, the temple inseparable from the feast. Oliver Dietrich, who had worked closely with Schmidt and succeeded him as co-director of the German Archaeological Institute's Göbekli Tepe research, found merit in both interpretations, arguing that the site likely served multiple functions simultaneously, that temple and feasting hall were not mutually exclusive categories, that ritual and politics, sacred and social, were in practice intertwined, inseparable, two aspects of the same communal gatherings, the same collective experiences, the same investment of labour and belief that made the monuments possible. The evidence supported both readings. The lack of domestic structures, the absence of permanent habitation, the sheer scale of the enclosures, the deliberate burial of the site, all pointed to a sacred function, to a place set apart, to a centre where the normal rules of daily life were suspended, where the ordinary gave way to the extraordinary. But the animal bones, the feasting debris, the evidence of large-scale food preparation, the beer production, the grinding stones, all pointed to social gatherings, to communal consumption, to events that were as much about building alliances and reinforcing social cohesion as about communing with the sacred. The site resisted reduction, refused to fit neatly into a single category, insisted on its own complexity. Andrew Collins, a British researcher and writer, had offered yet another interpretation, one rooted in shamanic cosmology, in the study of altered states of consciousness, in the cross-cultural patterns documented by anthropologists who had worked with indigenous societies where trance, where ecstatic experience, where direct contact with the spirit world remained central to religious practice. Collins looked at the animal imagery, at the predators and scavengers and dangerous creatures that dominated the pillars, at the T-shaped forms with their anthropomorphic features but faceless heads, at the enclosed circular spaces and the deliberate sensory deprivation of subterranean chambers, and saw a shamanic center, a place where ritual specialists entered trance states, where they took on the forms of animals, where they crossed the threshold between the human world and the spirit world, where they communicated with ancestor beings, with animal masters, with forces that governed the availability of game, the fertility of the land, the health and survival of the community. The pillars were not ancestors but spirit beings, the animals not symbols but allies, the enclosures not temples but threshold spaces, liminal zones where the boundaries dissolved, where transformation became possible, where the shaman moved between worlds, between identities, between human and animal, between flesh and spirit, returning with knowledge, with power, with the guidance necessary to sustain the community in an uncertain world. And then there was the astronomer's reading. In 2017, Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis, researchers at the University of Edinburgh, published a controversial paper arguing that Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe, the so-called vulture stone, was not a religious icon but a date stamp, an astronomical record encoded in stone, documenting a cometary impact event around 10,050 BCE, an event that correlated with the onset of the Younger Dryas, the abrupt cold period that had reshaped the climate, disrupted ecosystems, challenged human survival, and possibly driven the need for new subsistence strategies, for cultivation, for the intensive management of resources that eventually led to agriculture. The animals on the pillar, Sweatman and Tsikritsis argued, were constellations, the vulture representing Sagittarius, the scorpion representing Scorpius, the positions of the stars recording the date, the event, the catastrophe, the memory of a sky that burned, a world that ended, a trauma inscribed in stone so that it would not be forgotten. The hypothesis was bold, precise, testable, and it generated immediate pushback. Jens Nottroff and Oliver Dietrich, both members of the German Archaeological Institute team at Göbekli Tepe, published a detailed rebuttal pointing out that many pillars had been moved, recycled, reused across multiple phases of construction, that treating them as fixed astronomical markers was unwarranted, that the animals appeared in different contexts across the site, that the interpretation required selecting specific iconographic elements while ignoring others, that the astronomical alignments were not consistent, not reliable, not supported by the broader evidence. The debate continued, unresolved, the pillar refusing to yield a single answer, insisting on its own ambiguity, on the possibility that it meant multiple things, that it operated on multiple registers, that the builders encoded layers of meaning that modern interpreters, working from fragmentary evidence and distant cultural contexts, could not fully recover. The arguments did not cancel each other out. They coexisted, each containing threads of plausibility, each illuminating different aspects of the evidence, each revealing how much remained unknown, how much the mystery resisted resolution. The sites were temples and feasting halls and shamanic centers, and astronomical observatories and social experiments and monuments to the dead, and stages for competitive display and thresholds to the spirit world. They were all of these things, or none of them, or something else entirely, something for which modern categories and modern language were inadequate, something that required thinking from inside a worldview so different from contemporary experience that full comprehension might be impossible, might be beyond reach, might require not just evidence but imagination, not just analysis but empathy, not just scholarship but a willingness to sit with uncertainty, to accept that some questions do not have answers, that some mysteries endure. But one could try. One could look at the animals carved across the network, at the fox and the serpent and the leopard and the vulture, at the boar and the crane and the scorpion and the spider, at the creatures that dominated the iconography, that appeared again and again across different sites, different periods, different contexts, and attempt to think with them, to understand what they meant to the people who carved them, who saw them, who gathered in their presence, who invested so much labour in their creation. The animals were not random. They were not decoration. They were not merely aesthetic choices or symbolic shorthand for abstract concepts. They were agents, participants, beings with power, with presence, with meaning that exceeded their physical forms. Comparative mythology offered a framework for understanding them. David Lewis Williams and Jean Klotz, archaeologists who had spent decades studying Paleolithic cave art in Europe and southern Africa, had proposed that much of the imagery reflected shamanic cosmology, a worldview structured around the belief that the universe consisted of multiple realms, the human world, the spirit world, the underworld, and that certain individuals, through trance, through ritual, through ecstatic experience, could cross the boundaries between those realms, could travel to other worlds, could encounter beings that did not belong to the ordinary human sphere, beings that were both animal and more than animal, both physical and spiritual, both familiar and utterly strange. The animals painted on the walls of Lascaux and Chauvet and Altamira were not representations of hunted game but spirit beings, guardians of thresholds, allies and adversaries in journeys through the unseen, creatures whose forms the shaman could take on, whose power the shaman could channel, whose presence marked the boundary between the known and the unknown. The animals at Göbekli Tepe, at Karahan Tepe, at Sayburç followed a similar logic. They were predators, scavengers, dangerous creatures, leopards that hunted in darkness, serpents whose venom could kill, vultures that fed on the dead, scorpions whose sting brought pain and paralysis, foxes that moved between the human world and the wild. These were not prey animals. These were not the species that hunter-gatherers depended on for subsistence. These were the animals that threatened, that killed, that marked the edge of human control, that embodied the forces that could not be tamed, that reminded the living that they were vulnerable, that death was always near, that the boundary between safety and danger was thin, permeable, negotiable only through ritual, through knowledge, through the intervention of those who knew how to cross over, how to communicate, how to manage the relationship between human and animal, between the living and the dead, between this world and the next. The T-shaped pillars, with their anthropomorphic arms and belts and hands but no faces, were ancestor beings, spirit masters, entities that were once human but had crossed the threshold, had transformed, had become something else, something more, guardians of the boundary, keepers of knowledge, witnesses to the rituals performed in the enclosures, presences that demanded acknowledgement, demanded offerings, demanded the sustained labour and reverence that their carving and placement required. The animals adorning their surfaces were not attributes, but companions, allies, aspects of their power, the forms they could take, the forces they commanded. To stand before those pillars, to enter those enclosures, was to enter a space where the normal rules no longer applied, where the ancestors were present, where the spirit world pressed close, where transformation was possible, where the dead and the living met, where the boundary dissolved. And the skulls at Çayönü, at Göbekli Tepe, at Boncuklu Tarla were the physical anchors of that relationship, the material link between the living community and the ancestors who had gone before, who had crossed the threshold but had not disappeared, who remained present, who retained agency, who spoke through ritual, through memory, through the careful curation of their remains. The skull cult was not morbid. It was not a fixation on death. It was a practice of continuity, of refusal, of insistence that death did not sever the bonds between people, that the community extended backward in time as much as forward, that the ancestors were still part of the social fabric, still owed care, still demanded attention, still participated in the decisions and rituals and gatherings that shaped the lives of those who came after. The skull building at Çayönü was not a tomb but a council chamber, a place where the dead attended, where their presence was invoked, where the boundary between past and present collapsed into a single shared moment. A worldview began to cohere. Not a certainty, not a definitive answer, but a possibility, a way of thinking that made sense of the evidence, that connected the monuments and the animals and the skulls and the labour and the feasting and the deliberate burial into a coherent symbolic system. A cosmology in which human and animal, living and dead, earth and spirit, were not separate categories but overlapping realms, interconnected, permeable, navigable by those who knew the way, who performed the rituals, who maintained the relationships, who kept the ancestors present, who honoured the spirit beings, who ensured that the community remained in balance with forces larger than itself. The monuments were not just architecture. They were stages for that cosmology, spaces where it could be enacted, where it could be made real, where the abstract became concrete, where belief became experience, where the community gathered to remember, to renew, to cross the threshold together, to participate in something larger than any individual life, something that connected them to the land, to the animals, to the ancestors, to the long history of human presence in that landscape. A history that stretched back tens of thousands of years, back to the Paleolithic hunters who had painted animals on cave walls, who had understood the world as alive, as animated, as full of beings that demanded respect, demanded ritual, demanded the sustained effort and care and reverence that the Taş Tepeler sites embodied in stone. The chamber at Karahan Tepe waits in silence, carved into the bedrock 10 kilometers southeast of Göbekli Tepe, its walls and floor shaped not by construction, but by subtraction, by the patient removal of limestone until what remained was a hollow, a womb, a threshold cut directly into the living stone. The excavation team led by Necmi Karol entered Structure AB in the autumn of 2022, descending into a space that had been sealed for over 10,000 years, and what they found there was not another enclosure, not another ring of pillars standing free, but something more intimate, more arresting, more unsettling. 11 T-shaped pillars carved in place, rising from the floor as if they had always been part of the bedrock, as if they had grown there, and among them, emerging from the stone itself, a human face. Not a mask, not a stylized representation, but a face, bearded, long-necked, tilted slightly forward as if leaning into the chamber, presiding over the space with an expression that was neither serene nor menacing, but simply present, watchful, attentive, aware. The features were naturalistic, precise, the brow prominent, the nose straight, the eyes deep set beneath heavy lids, the jaw angular and strong, the beard carved in careful striations that suggested individual hairs, a level of anatomical detail unprecedented in the region, unprecedented anywhere in the pre-pottery Neolithic world. This was not an icon. This was a person, rendered in stone, caught at a specific moment, in a specific condition, submerged in the earth, emerging from it, born from it, suspended between two states, neither fully buried nor fully free. The face was not alone. At the centre of the chamber stood another figure, larger, life-sized, carved in full relief from the bedrock. A seated human form, 2.3 meters tall, knees drawn up, arms resting on legs, anatomical detail explicit and unambiguous, ribs visible along the torso, genitalia clearly defined. The posture deliberate and formal, the expression once again blank, faceless, but the body fully articulated, fully human, fully present. The figure sat in the middle of the space, surrounded by the 11 pillars, and the arrangement was unmistakable. This was a gathering, a council, a ritual assembly frozen in stone, and the central figure was not an observer, but a participant, perhaps a supplicant, perhaps an initiate, perhaps something else entirely, something for which the modern vocabulary of ritual and religion has no precise equivalent. The chamber floor showed signs of repeated use, shallow pits carved into the limestone, later filled and sealed with terrazzo plaster, smooth and polished, the kind of surface that required sustained labour, that required care, that required the mixing of lime and ash and water, and the patient application of layer after layer, until the floor gleamed in the firelight, until it reflected the faces of those who gathered there, until it became a mirror, a boundary, a surface that separated the world above from the world below, the living from the dead, the profane from the sacred. What happened in that chamber? What ritual unfolded there, season after season, year after year, century after century across the 1500 years of the site's active life? Necmi Karol and his team proposed an interpretation that resonated with everything the documentary had uncovered, that connected the labour and the feasting and the skulls and the animal grammar and the wheat connection and the deliberate burial into a single coherent act. The chamber was a place of transformation, a place of initiation, a place where individuals underwent a ritual passage from one state to another, from child to adult, from outsider to member, from living to ancestor, from human to something more. The face emerging from the floor was not a portrait of a god or a dead king, but an image of the initiate himself, caught in the moment of transition, submerged in the earth, passing through the stone, being born from the bedrock into a new identity, a new role, a new relationship with the community and the ancestors and the spirit world. The 11 pillars surrounding the central figure were witnesses, guardians, perhaps the ancestors themselves, the ones who had already crossed the threshold, who stood watch over those who followed, who ensured that the passage was completed, that the transformation succeeded, that the boundary held. The chamber was not a tomb. It was not a sanctuary in the sense of a place apart from the world. It was a stage, a machine, an instrument for the enactment of the most fundamental drama of human existence. The passage between worlds, the negotiation of boundaries, the transformation of the self through ritual, through endurance, through the shared experience of crossing from one state to another, in the presence of the community, in the presence of the ancestors, in the presence of the land itself, which had been carved away to make room for the ritual, which had been shaped into a threshold, which had become part of the ceremony, part of the transformation, part of the knowledge that was being transmitted generation after generation across the long span of the pre-pottery Neolithic. Standing there, in the limestone chamber beneath the dry plateau of southeastern Turkey, one cannot help but feel the weight of it, the density of meaning compressed into stone, the lives invested in the carving and the gathering and the ritual repetition that made the place sacred, that made the transformation real, that made the ancestors present. The builders of Karahan Tepe did not leave a written explanation. They did not record the words spoken in that chamber, the songs sung, the prayers offered, the questions asked. But they left the face, emerging from the floor, looking up, looking out, looking forward, and in that face is the answer to the question that has haunted this documentary from the beginning. Why did they build? They built because they needed to. They built because the passage from one world to another, from birth to death, from human to ancestor, from ignorance to knowledge, required a place, required a structure, required the labour and the stone and the gathering of hundreds, required the sustained effort of generations, required the investment of everything they had, time, energy, resources, belief, into the creation of a space where transformation could happen, where the boundary could be crossed, where the ancestors could be present, where the living and the dead could meet, where the questions that have no answers could be asked in stone, in ritual, in the presence of others, in the knowledge that the asking itself was the point, that the transformation was the goal, that the passage was the sacred act, that the place where it happened mattered more than palaces or granaries or walls, that the first thing they chose to build, when they decided to build at all, was a threshold. The world did not stay still. Between approximately 8500 and 8000 BCE, the great enclosures of Göbekli Tepe and several of its sister sites across the highlands of southeastern Turkey were buried, sealed, or fell out of active use, their pillars entombed beneath tons of limestone rubble, their floors covered, their enclosures filled, their rituals ended. The archaeological record documents the closure with precision. Radiocarbon dates cluster tightly around the turn of the 9th millennium. Stratigraphy shows deliberate coordinated backfilling. The rubble is not random collapse but carefully placed fill mixed with animal bones and grinding stones and broken tools, the kind of material that speaks of feasting, of gathering, of ritual closure, of an ending that was known and chosen and enacted collectively, not a sudden catastrophe, but a long goodbye. Klaus Schmidt, who spent 2 decades excavating Göbekli Tepe, proposed that the burial was intentional, that the communities who had built the monuments decided, for reasons that remain opaque, to close them, to seal them, to end the cycle of gathering and feasting and ritual that had defined their world for 1500 years. Lee Clare, who inherited the excavation after Schmidt's death in 2014, offered a more cautious interpretation. The abandonment was gradual, the result of slope-slide events and the recycling of building materials, the natural erosion of a site that had outlived its purpose, that had been superseded by new practices, new settlements, new ways of organising the relationship between people and the sacred. The debate continues, but the fact remains, around 8000 BCE, the monuments were closed, and the world they had made came to an end. Why? 3 explanatory models present themselves, each grounded in evidence, each insufficient on its own, each offering a partial view of a transformation too large and too complex to reduce to a single cause. The first is climatic. The pre-boreal oscillation, a period of rapid warming followed by abrupt cooling between 9000 and 8000 BCE, altered the resource base of the upper Mesopotamian highlands, shifting rainfall patterns, changing vegetation zones, disrupting the seasonal movements of gazelle herds and the availability of wild plants, that had sustained the mobile hunter-gatherer bands for millennia. The monuments had been built in a specific ecological context, one that allowed dispersed groups to converge seasonally at ritual centres without the need for permanent settlement, without the logistical burden of year-round agriculture, without the hierarchies and specializations that would later define village life. If the climate shifted, if the herds moved, if the wild grains failed or became less predictable, the convergence model collapsed and the monuments lost their function, their relevance, their capacity to draw the labour and belief that had sustained them. The second model is social. By 8500 BCE, the transition to agriculture was accelerating across the region. Domesticated corn and emmer wheat were spreading from their origin points near Karakada and the Taurus foothills. Villages were consolidating, populations were sedentarizing, and the old pattern of seasonal convergence at shared sanctuaries was becoming redundant, incompatible with the demands of farming, with the need to remain near fields through the growing season, with the rhythms of planting and harvest that replaced the rhythms of migration and gathering. The monuments had been built by a world in motion. The world that replaced them was a world rooted in place, and the sanctuaries were left behind, abandoned not because they failed, but because they succeeded, because the transformation they had initiated, the shift from mobile foraging to settled agriculture, had reached a point where the old rituals no longer fit, where the new villages needed their own sacred spaces, their own ancestors, their own boundaries, and the great convergence sites on the ridges and plateaus became relics, memories, places that belonged to the past. The third model is ritual. The burial of the monuments was not passive abandonment but active closure, a deliberate ending enacted by the communities who had built them, who had gathered there, who had invested generations of labour and belief into the creation of those spaces, and who decided collectively to bring the cycle to an end, to seal the enclosures, to bury the pillars, to close the threshold. This interpretation treats the burial as part of the ritual itself, as the final act in a long performance that had spanned 15 centuries, a cosmological decision that the cycle was complete, that the transformation the monuments had facilitated had run its course, that the ancestors were ready to rest, that the boundary could be closed. The evidence for this model is circumstantial but compelling. The care with which the fill was placed, the inclusion of ritual debris, animal bones, grinding stones, the remnants of feasts, the absence of destruction or violence, the sense that the closure was orderly, coordinated, respectful. If the monuments were thresholds, places where the living and the dead met, where transformations were enacted, where the boundary between worlds was negotiable, then the burial was the final crossing, the moment when the threshold itself was sealed, when the ancestors were committed to the earth, when the community decided that the time had come to let go, to move forward, to build a new world on the foundation the monuments had laid. All three models are plausible, all three are partial. The truth, if it can be recovered at all, is likely some combination of climate and social change and ritual closure, overlapping and reinforcing one another, a cascade of causes that together produced the end of an era. What is certain is this: the world the monuments made survived them. The archaeological record at Çayönü and Boncuklu in central Turkey and Çatalhöyük in the Konya Plain shows the trajectory clearly. At Çayönü, the architectural sequence moves through 6 phases, from the round plan structures of the earliest occupation around 2200 BCE to the increasingly complex grill plan buildings of the 8th millennium, with their elevated floors and interior partitions and evidence of permanent settlement, of agriculture, of domesticated animals, of a life tied to place rather than movement. At Boncuklu, founded around 8200 BCE, the settlement covers 4 hectares, contains at least 400 rooms, and shows the full consolidation of village life. Houses entered through roof openings, burials beneath floors, craft specialization, obsidian trade, a population sustained by cultivated crops and herded animals, a world that was settled, agricultural, architecturally domestic. At Çatalhöyük, beginning around 7400 BCE, the village became a town, dense and complex and stratified, with plaster-walled houses adorned with painted murals and moulded reliefs, with shrines and burials and evidence of social differentiation, with a population in the thousands sustained by intensive farming and herding, a world fully committed to the agricultural life that the monuments had, in some indirect but essential way, inaugurated. But something was lost. The great convergence sites, the monumental sanctuaries where hundreds had gathered to feast and to witness and to participate in rituals that connected them to the ancestors and the animals and the land, were gone. The new villages had their own sacred spaces, shrines in houses, burials beneath floors, painted walls depicting ancestors and animals. But the scale was different, the labour was different, the experience was different. The monuments had been collective, public, shared across dispersed communities who came together seasonally and then dispersed again, who remained mobile, who retained the freedom and the isolation and the egalitarianism of the hunter-gatherer life. The villages were permanent, hierarchical, bounded, their sacred spaces embedded in the domestic architecture, their rituals performed within the confines of the household or the neighbourhood, their ancestors claimed by families rather than shared by the entire landscape. The transformation the monuments had facilitated, the shift from foraging to farming, had succeeded, but in succeeding it had foreclosed the very conditions that made the monuments possible. The world after 8000 BCE was more productive, more stable, more densely populated, but it was also more constrained, more hierarchical, more divided, and the sacred had moved indoors, had become private, had lost the monumental scale and the collective participation that had defined it in the age of the sanctuaries. What was buried with the pillars was not just stone, but a way of being in the world, a way of organising the relationship between people and the sacred, a way of crossing boundaries and maintaining connections and enacting transformations that required the labour of hundreds, the convergence of dispersed communities, the shared belief that the threshold mattered, that the ancestors were present, that the passage between worlds was real and necessary and demanded everything they had to give. The sanctuaries were the last gasp of a world in motion. The villages were the first breath of a world rooted in place. Both were fully human, both were fully modern, but they were not the same. The story resolves not with a verdict, but with a reorientation. The people of Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe and Sayburç and Boncuklu Tarla and Çayönü were not proto-humans edging slowly towards civilization, not primitives groping in the darkness of ignorance, not the earliest fumbling steps on a long climb toward the achievements of agriculture and writing and cities and states. They were us, anatomically modern humans, cognitively identical to every person alive today, with the same capacity for abstract thought, for symbolic reasoning, for cooperation and creativity, and the construction of meaning. They had language, they had art, they had kinship systems and trade networks and ritual practices, and a cosmology sophisticated enough to sustain the labour and belief necessary to carve multi-ton pillars from bedrock, to transport them across kilometres of rough terrain, to erect them in circles and decorate them with animals, and gather in the enclosures to feast and to witness, and to enact the transformations that connected the living to the dead, the human to the animal, the earth to the spirit. They were not waiting for agriculture to unlock their potential. They were not stumbling towards civilization. They chose, as their first collective act of monumental construction, not a granary, not a palace, not a fortification, not a wall to keep enemies out or resources in, but a place to engage the sacred together, a place to ask the questions that have no answers, a place to cross the threshold between worlds, a place to remember the ancestors, a place to participate in something larger than any individual life, something that connected them to the land and the animals and the long history of human presence in that landscape, a history that stretched back tens of thousands of years, back into the Paleolithic, back to the painted caves and the carved figurines and the careful burials that testified to the same capacity for belief, for ritual, for the construction of meaning in the face of mortality, that the sanctuaries of the pre-pottery Neolithic embodied in stone. The conventional story placed monuments at the terminus of a long development. First came subsistent security, then surplus, then specialization, then hierarchy, then the leisure and the labor to build temples and tombs and palaces. The sanctuaries of southeastern Turkey demolish that story. They place monuments at the origin. They show that the first thing human beings built, when they decided to build at all, was a place to gather, a place to enact the sacred, a place to honour the ancestors, a place to negotiate the boundary between the living and the dead, a place to ask the questions. Who are we? Where do we come from? What happens when we die? What forces move through the world? What knowledge did the ancestors possess? What do we owe to those who came before? What do we owe to those who will come after, that have no final answers but that demand, nonetheless, to be asked, to be enacted, to be carved into stone and raised on ridges and witnessed by hundreds, who gather in firelight and feast together and participate together in the knowledge that the asking matters, that the threshold matters, that the ancestors matter, that the passage matters, that the transformation is real. What the builders of Göbekli Tepe have permanently given archaeology, and given us, is the knowledge that the sacred came first, not as a byproduct of agricultural surplus, not as an afterthought tacked onto settled village life, not as a luxury afforded by leisure, but as a priority, a necessity, a driver, a force powerful enough to mobilize the labor of hundreds, to sustain the quarrying and carving and transport and erection of pillars weighing tens of tons, to organize the feasting and the gathering and the rituals that made the place sacred, to maintain the sites across 15 centuries, and finally to bury them with care when the cycle ended. The sanctuaries were not built because people had solved the problem of survival. They were built because survival was not enough. Because human beings, then as now, needed meaning, needed connection, needed to participate in something larger, needed to honor the dead, needed to acknowledge the forces that move through the world, needed to enact the passage from one state to another, needed to ask the questions that define what it means to be human. The monuments are the proof. The pillars stand, or stood before they were buried, as witnesses to the fact that we have always been this way. That 10,000 years ago on a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, people who had no cities, no writing, no bronze or iron, no kings or priests or bureaucracies, people who lived by hunting and gathering, who moved with the seasons, who knew the animals and the plants and the rhythms of the land, chose to invest everything they had into the creation of places where the sacred could be encountered, where transformations could be enacted, where the ancestors could be honoured, where the boundary between worlds could be crossed, where the questions could be asked in stone. They did not need to build. They chose to. And what they chose to build first, before anything else, was a threshold. The face emerging from the chamber floor at Karahan Tepe still watches, still presides, still waits, carved into the limestone, born from the stone, frozen at the moment of crossing, and in that face is the knowledge that has always been ours, that we are the ones who ask, who build, who gather, who remember, who refuse to let death be the end, who carve our questions into stone and raise them toward the sky, and trust that the asking itself, the labour, the gathering, the ritual, the passage, is enough.